Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Berntgen from EMA's Scientific Evidence Generation Department. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this workshop on support for development of orphan medicines, incentives, scientific advice, and funding schemes, organized by EMA and its Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products. The focus of this workshop is to engage with the communities that are at the forefront of medicines development in rare and neglected diseases. Collectively, we want to encourage early and efficient interactions between developers and European regulators by highlighting pre-marketing support for medicines development in rare diseases. We will hear views across stakeholders in relation to early medicine development. We will learn about experiences with regulatory interactions. And the timing feels right. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the introduction of the orphan regulation in the European Union. Much progress has been made during this time, and many experiences were made on all sides. More than 180 orphan medicines have been approved for the European patients. Concepts such as orphan condition continue to evolve along the advancements of science. The types of medicines cover not only chemicals and biologicals, but more and more advanced therapies. And we, as regulators, want to facilitate early engagement, such as providing support for medicine development by academics and clinical researchers. This is a priority for EMA, and the example of the recent launch of free scientific advice to academia and non-profit research organizations developing orphan medicines intends to align research and regulatory requirements early during medicines development, as described in a very recent paper. In this context, we note that the European Commission has conducted an evaluation of the regulatory framework for orphan medicines, along with pediatrics. And this showed that despite the objective success of the orphan regulation, many disease areas have still not attracted sufficient attention and need more dedicated research. For example, the evaluation has highlighted the need to stimulate development of medicines in areas of unmet need, noting that a very large proportion of rare diseases still has no treatment options. It also provides insights into the value of development support provided to sponsors. And on this basis, an Inception Impact Assessment has been launched last week on Wednesday for public consultation until 6th of January 2021. I encourage all of you to look into these future perspectives and provide your views. Today, we focus on the current regulatory framework. Existing tools such as orphan designation, protocol assistance, and the PRIME scheme will be explained in the context of early product development strategy. Furthermore, the COMP will illustrate key elements essential for a successful orphan designation application and maintenance of orphan status. And importantly, we learn from the stakeholders about the challenges and perceived value of their interactions with regulators. As an example, last week, a paper was published in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology outlining how earlier and more frequent scientific advice could help ATMP developments by public bodies to preempt delays at marketing authorization stage. Carefully addressing quality and non-clinical issues before entering the pivotal phase of development will clear the path for smooth clinical development and successful marketing authorization. It is with this mindset that we should hold today's discussion. In this context, the multi-stakeholder approach taken for today's workshop is key to stimulate and facilitate development of orphan medicines in neglected disease areas. And I'm thrilled to see that this workshop has raised an extraordinary interest. It is with my pleasure to hand over to Violeta Stoyanova-Beninska the chair of the EMA's Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products, to provide further insights into the objectives and arrangements for today's discussion and to guide us through the workshop. I wish you all a productive and successful day. Violeta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good morning. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this workshop. The impressively high number of registrations is an indication of the high interest in the topic, and therefore I hope that the event will meet the high expectations. As Michael has already mentioned, the year 2000 is a very particular one in many ways. If it was not for the COVID-19 pandemic and its implications on our lives, we would have probably marked this anniversary of 20 years of the orphan regulation in the European Union in a different way. But nevertheless, we have it now online, which means that we have a higher number of participants. And the most important is that this is a year of evaluation, reflection, and preparation for the future. As you know, one of the main tasks of the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products is to incentivize development of medicinal products for rare disease, and in particular, to foster that development in the neglected disease areas. With current and also future changes on the horizon, the Committee's ambition is to keep up with the most recent scientific developments and to be future-proof. And as already mentioned, this is the mindset we have today and in general, and we want to have the discussions in the workshop with this mindset. This idea for the workshop started almost a year ago, and it is evolving because of based on the experience that we have from the past. And I want to spend very few minutes on only one slide, which is providing some figures summarizing the regulatory procedures which are related to orphan drug development in the European Union. And here we have summarized only the past 5 years. I'm afraid I cannot move the slides, so I would just ask my colleagues who are in the EMA building to do this for me. Thank you very much. So if you can move to the next slide, it is the only one I want to draw your attention to. Thank you very much. Here you can see we have some statistics about how many applications for orphan designations have been there since 2016 and how many of these have been successful. We can also look at the number of medicinal products which made it to the market in general, and the proportion of orphan medicines. These are the red bars. Then the protocol assistance letters, which have been finalized, and as you will hear during the workshop today, this is scientific advice specifically dedicated to products with an orphan designation. It changes in the different years, but what you can see is that it is quite an important proportion. And then last but not least, we have the prime procedure in place, which is 5 years now. And there again, you can see that a reasonable number of the prime applications and procedures are for orphan drugs, which is not surprising because these are the products which need additional support. And we will talk about this today. So these are the figures which tell us something about the numbers. But of course, much more important is what is behind these numbers. And the questions that we have is why there is a difference in the quality of the applications that we see at the committee. Who are the drivers of development in orphan disease? Why some designated products never continue development? Why neglected disease areas do not attract interest from sponsors? And with this, we were also considering the fact that most of the time, development, especially for rare disease, starts in a small academic group. And then it goes into the hands of several sponsors before, in the end, it can reach the market, most probably on behalf of a big pharmaceutical company. So that means that there is a need for an integrated support of all participants in this process. And hopefully, the orphan drug designation is just the gate opener which will be followed by a clever, efficient, and finally successful drug development. Back to the agenda of today. I think it is rather ambitious considering the time allocated for the event, but we do hope to achieve at least a few of the goals that we have in our announcement, mainly to highlight once again what are the existing incentives and explain how to use them efficiently. What is the impact of pre-marketing support? And here Michael was referring to one recent article which is illustrating that, but also to understand how early interactions with regulators can be appropriate and can be supported. Of course, last but definitely not least, we want to learn from the experience from the different sponsors. And we have a third dedicated session in the workshop, listening to views of SMEs, patient organizations, and academics. But before we start, in a way to test the system, but also to understand who is our audience today, I would like to ask you to answer 3 questions which are in our Slido. And these are poll questions. Yes, this is the first one. We would like to know from which country you are joining this event today. And I will give you maybe 30 seconds to 1 minute to respond to this. And in the end of the day, we will also come back to these numbers. Okay, you can see already some participation from mainly European countries, but also from other parts of the world. And I can only see the results, but you can see how many people have voted already, or voted, expressed their participation. And then please, whenever we have sufficient responses, maybe we can stop this poll, but I think we can still wait maybe for a few more seconds. It is still changing, meaning people are responding. And considering that I see people have joined from Singapore, United States, these are distant destinations, maybe it takes a little bit more, I'm not sure, to receive all these responses. Wow, it's quite impressive, I must say. Then I believe we spent enough time on this question, but we also have the next one, which is about your affiliation. And when you were registering for the workshop, you did mention what is your affiliation, but of course we would like to know this again, how many people from academia, SMEs, big pharmaceutical companies, consultants. Okay, numbers are growing, and I can see now the number of responses. So it really takes some time, but I think it is important because knowing what is our audience will help the speakers today to adjust their presentations to the audience and to the potential interest which might be out there. In the meantime, I just want to let you know that we had more than 1,000 people who registered for the event. Probably not everyone is already watching, and therefore we never know how many participants will respond to the poll. But we need to give it some time. And I think the positive news is that we can see that the system is working, which is always a little bit of a challenge with online events. Thank you. And not to spend too much time on these poll questions, you will see a few more in the course of today. We can probably go to the last one, which is about your experience with the regulatory system, of course, related to orphan medicinal products. So have you ever been to an orphan designation application or protocol assistance? Okay, so I see also participants without any experience, which is also interesting to know. And this is, of course, one of the main drivers to decide to have a workshop dedicated on early drug development. And I think we can wait because at least about 150 to 200 participants are able to respond rather swiftly and quickly to the poll. Oh. So a tiny proportion maybe has experience with PRIME, we can see. Quite a number of people have made use of the protocol assistance, of course, after having a orphan drug designation, so the percentage there is more or less comparable. But it means that there are quite a number of participants who would have questions on any of these procedures. And while we are giving a few more seconds for people to respond, I would like to ask you to make use of the interactive possibilities of these workshops. So during the workshop, you can ask questions or send comments either through the chat or through the dedicated email box. And we have colleagues who will be collecting and clustering the questions and using them for the discussion sessions, which are following each of the 3 sessions that we have today. With this, I think we are perfectly on time to start our workshop. And the first session is dedicated to orphan drug development. We have several speakers, but I will introduce just the first 2 of them. Dr. Naumann-Winter is the member of the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products from Germany since 2013, and she's also a clinical assessor at the BfArM. And Dr. Darius Matusevicius is from the Swedish agency. He's also a clinical assessor, and he has joined the comp as a member in 2018. So, Dr. Naumann-Winter, I hand over to you for the first presentation of today. And I wish you all a very fruitful and interesting workshop to follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to welcome you here from far away, Singapore, United States, very courageous and to be, because you're not synchronized with our time. I think that you come from offices, but also maybe sometimes from your living room. So I'm very happy to welcome you to this introduction on orphan medicinal orphan designation and orphan medicinal products in the EU. First, I will give you some background information on the underlying idea and on the history of the orphan drug regulation. And so here I give you the recital from the basic regulation, which went into force in the year 2000. Here, the rarity of a condition was linked to the unwillingness of the pharmaceutical companies to develop products for rare diseases. Because if you treat few patients, you may not necessarily recover the costs of the investments made. Europe was only the last to follow the example of the USA. To set the example in the early 80s, And then Japan and Australia followed, and the EU in the year 2000. In all these different jurisdictions, support was introduced for companies which plan to develop the medicines for rare diseases, because the rules that apply for what quality and efficacy and safety data are needed would be the same for even for the rarer and for the more frequent diseases. So they are patients with rare diseases are entitled to the same quality. So there's no exceptions to the rule, but you will be supported by these legislations. So in the Orphan legislation was introduced as a European law to stimulate all the research, the development, and bringing to the market of appropriate medications. And it's a voluntary procedure, free of charge. And because it's voluntary, we work with incentives rather than obligations. And these incentives are divided into pre-marketing and post-marketing incentives. And they're all meant to help you to make it easier and less costly to apply to the rules that are valid for the development of products. And and my colleagues Helene, Casaert, and Armando Magrelli, and also Daria Julkowska will talk about these incentives in much more detail than I am. This is just an overview. And some are not necessarily officially in the legislation, but they're also real, because it may help to get additional funding when you have when you are included in an official support program. And in some countries, especially in Germany, it has impact on the reimbursement procedure later on if this product is successfully developed. The most important post-marketing incentive that is known for the orphans is the 10-year market exclusivity, which may even take 12 years if you are developing a product according to the PIP rules. So what are the criteria to get an orphan designation? The sponsor has to show that it's targeting a rare condition for diagnosis, prevention, or treatment. And this disease also has to be life-threatening or chronically debilitating. The rarity has to be shown either by prevalence, which is then has a threshold of maximum 5 in 10,000, which is similar but not completely the same in the different orphan legislations we have around the globe. And there's also a second way to show it, but this is very, very rarely used only. This is according to the insufficient return of investment. And then the product has to show that it's the first treatment that is authorized for this condition, or if it's not the first, but there are already products available, that this product will be of significant benefit to those affected by the condition. And Darius will talk you about these criteria in more detail in the second part of this talk. So who's involved in the process? It's the COM, the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products. And we are a scientific committee, and there's one member state, one delegate per member state, and including 3 patient representatives who have full voting rights. This was, by the way, the first committee to introduce this role for patients. And the COM makes recommendations to the European Commission, which then officially grants the orphan drug status. It usually is an agreement, but it has not to be in agreement with the COM, and then has a register which lists all the active and the expired, or those that have changed their mind and have withdrawn the orphan drug from the register. The COM has to look at least twice. So first, it's checking the criteria at the initial orphan designation, as we call it. There we need some data, but it can be early development, and it has to be before the marketing authorization application is made. And there are some criteria, especially the one with the significant benefit, where we accept more plausible hypotheses. This is the selection of the candidates. At the time of marketing authorization, we have to check again whether the criteria are still fulfilled. It happened because sometimes there are 10 years between the initial orphan designation and the marketing authorization. That prevalence has changed, for example. So these have to be checked. And also other products could have been authorized in the meantime. And this is in a different way, but it somehow copies what Violeta already mentioned at the beginning. So it shows how the legislation was taken up over the years. And by the different lines, the highest one is the number of applications submitted. The lower lines are those which were officially granted by the European Commission. And then you see this violet line. Because this is a procedure free of charge, when the comp is not in agreement with the sponsor that the criteria are sufficiently demonstrated, the sponsors can withdraw and usually submit at a later stage. And this is quite frequent. There's no names mentioned. This is just discussed that there was an application for this condition and some information is given, but this is an anonymous withdrawal and usually can reapply. And what is important to differentiate is that the orphan designation is not the same as an orphan medicinal product. We have more than 2,200 valid orphan designations in approximately 550 conditions at the moment in the register. And but we have close to 200 orphan medicinal products which were authorized over time. And approximately, because this is a moving target with all the expiries and newcomers, and so we have approximately 120 who have an active orphan drug status in approximately 130 orphan condition. And this means that there are orphan medicines that have more than one orphan designation, so they are covering more than one rare disease. And also sometimes there are sometimes conditions that have several orphan medicinal products authorized at the same time. And sometimes the people complain between the gap between the 2,200 orphan designations and only roughly or less than 10%. But I think it's the gap between the high number of orphan conditions which is showing, and we hope that you, as one of the academia and the SMEs who are known to bring a lot of innovation also into the field, that you will help to address this the gap between the orphan conditions and the orphan products. The orphans are a very heterogeneous family of drugs. We have almost all therapeutic areas, oncology and metabolic diseases leading. We have the entire spectrum of the rare conditions, with almost half of them in the very low, less than 1 in 10,000 prevalence area. And we have also a vast majority of different types of products. The majority is innovative, but they're also known with new formulations of the same known product, or we have repurposed known products for new conditions. And the majority still is chemical products, but still the ATMPs, so gene therapies, etc., are on the rise. So up to now, the biotechnology ATMP makes about 1/3. And I don't want to go through all the lengthy titles of the underlying legal documents, but I would like to highlight here that there are underlying guidelines available that can help you through the process. And sometimes you need to check whether you are checking the right documents, because at the time, over time, there have been several revisions and some documents, for example, were also superseded. The Commission notice superseded the communication. So with this overview of the legal documents, I hand over to Darius, who is now walking you through the legislation process. At least I try to.
Thank you, Frauke, for such introduction to orphan drug world. So the first step in the whole process is definition of the condition. If the condition is defined, the next step is to demonstrate medical plausibility. After demonstration of medical plausibility, the key step is to establish that the disease is rare. And the Frauke has already mentioned the criteria. It is less than 5 per 10,000. And finally, if the prevalence is established, and in cases where authorized products are available in European Union for treatment of orphan drugs, then significant benefit should be demonstrated. In normal case, the condition definition should be very simple. Typically, it is recognized distinct disease or a syndrome with clearly defined etiology, pathophysiology, clinical signs, and it usually does not cause any problems in definition. In defining condition, we have to take some additional considerations. For example, if the condition proposed is a stage of the disease, or it is defined by the severity. In some cases, it could be iatrogenic complication or adverse event of some poisoning or with some drug or environmental toxin. Additional considerations should be made also if the subset of the condition is valid or not valid. And validity of the subset is usually defined when the candidate drug intended to treat rare disease is working only in specific subset of the non-rare condition. So the committee members summarized some experience from past years with assessment of the conditions in publication published a couple of years ago, and identified some areas where it is challenging to define a condition. For example, subsetting of the diseases is usually not accepted based on biomarkers. And this tendency is quite often seen in oncological conditions where the research is progressing and a lot of genetical biomarkers are identified. On the other hand, in some cases, the committee accepted stages of the disease. And the example of this is, for example, major and intermediate beta thalassemia cases. Regarding symptoms of the disease, it is only acceptable if the symptoms are essential for the condition. And if we go to the next slide, some two additional areas were identified for challenges. For example, treatment modalities typically were accepted by the historically were accepted by the committee only in hematopoietic stem cell transplantation and solid organ transplantation. Poisoning with environmental toxins is also acceptable. However, intoxication with opioids or paracetamol were not accepted as orphan conditions because the committee considered that this is adverse events often of drugs which are well described in other regulatory documents, and therefore it could be controlled, in contrast to environmental toxins where poisoning is usually unintended and unpredictable. When the condition is defined, if we go to the next slide, the medical plausibility should be demonstrated, and medical plausibility can be demonstrated in non-clinical animal models or presenting some preliminary clinical data. It is important experimental design of non-clinical models, taking into consideration what it is applied for. If the treatment approach is used, so experimental models are expected to be representing this paradigm. Usually, the committee expects demonstration of effect of the drug on some functional endpoints of the animal models or survival of animals. In general, it is not enough to demonstrate just in vitro data or claim novelty of mechanism of action. Some experience from the committee assessing rare conditions and medical plausibility in rare neurological diseases were summarized in publication by committee members and members from Orphan Office. On the next slide, you can see the suggestion how committee thinks, and if the animal model is well established for a certain condition, it is usually easier to demonstrate medical plausibility. Also, if functional endpoints are available, it is pretty much straightforward way. However, if animal models are not established for the condition, or functional endpoints are not very translatable to the human condition, then the committee expects some preliminary clinical data from patients. When the condition is set and medical plausibility is demonstrating, the rarity of the condition should be demonstrated by presenting the prevalence for the rare disease. On the next slide, there is a key definition for prevalence used in orphan drug designation. And typically, for demonstration of rarity of the condition, the thorough review of literature available on rare disease in European Union is expected. If prevalence cannot be demonstrated in the whole European Union, then reasons how it can be extrapolated from single country, taking into consideration geographical distribution of the disease, should be presented by the sponsor. For chronic diseases, the committee expects demonstration of cumulative prevalence. For some diseases with short duration, usually incidence is accepted instead of, for example, point prevalence. The committee does not have too much experience in designating orphan status for diagnostic tools intended to diagnose rare diseases. And in this situation, it is usually expected that the number of persons that are candidates for being administered the drug on an annual basis is presented. We come to the very specific issue of significant benefit. This is a pure European requirement in cases when the authorized treatments are available for rare diseases, and the new compound should demonstrate or should present the data allowing to make an assumption of a clinically relevant advantage due to improved efficacy or improved safety. Additional step could be done, demonstration that the product is having significant benefit over authorized treatment by improving patient's condition, so-called major contribution to patient care. And on the next slide, I would like to say a few words about how it could be demonstrated by showing improved efficacy, which is the most common way to demonstrate significant benefit, and it could be done in animal models or presenting clinical data from some exploratory studies. In general, committee expects that this comparison with authorized product is done in the same experiment in non-clinical models. However, some comparison to published literature data could be also acceptable. For clinical data, it is understandable that in exploratory studies, usually data are generated with experimental compound. And in such cases, comparison to literature description of clinical studies with authorized products is acceptable at the stage of designation. In general, it is expected that both negative effects or low efficacy of the compound approved already for indication is demonstrated, as well as positive signs of the approved drug. The next possibility to demonstrate significant benefit could be based on safety, but this is very rare situation, since early in the clinical development, usually safety profile of the new compound is not very well established. and it is very difficult to claim improved safety at this specific stage. It could be an exception if the drug is already approved in another indication, and then safety could be extrapolated to the rare disease. Finally, the significant benefit can be demonstrated also by showing improvement in or major contribution to patient care. And usually it is related to easier administration of the new drug, for example, oral administration versus intravenous, or improved adherence to administration of drug by, for example, improved form of drug, and instead of administering everyday subcutaneous injections, administering, let's say, a subcutaneous injection once a week. However, quality data, quality of life data should be presented in order to support such claim. Finally, I would like to point out sponsors to the publications published by the committee members, where some considerations are discussed. If I go to the next slide, and I would like to thank now you for your attention, and I would like to introduce two speakers from the Agency Research and Innovation Task Force. Helene Casaert is Scientific Administrator at the SME Office, and Rosan Vegter works as Academia Liaison. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So yes, I'm Helene. I work for the SME office at the EMA, and I have prepared this presentation with my colleague Rosan from the Academia office. So today what I'm going to do is going to introduce to you the support that is available at the EMA for SMEs and academia. So I would like to cover 3 points today. So the first one will be the specific support for SMEs and academia at EMA. Then I will give some explanation on the support to innovation that is available at EMA level. And then I'll finish the presentation by giving some tips and a recommendation for you. So let's start with the SME office and the academia entry points. So SMEs are an important source of innovation, as you know, and this is why there was an EU regulation aiming at promoting innovation and development of new medicines by SMEs that entered into force in December 2005. So with this regulation, the SME office within the EMA was set up 15 years ago now. So we are celebrating 15 years of the SME office, and the SME office is a dedicated contact point within the EMA, providing assistance to SMEs, facilitating communication with SMEs internally and externally, and engaging with EU bodies and industry stakeholders on SME matters. So to benefit from the support from the EMA for the SMEs and the SME office, the first step for a company is to be assigned SME status. So a company who wants that support needs to apply for SME status at the SME office. The SME office is going to review the application, will give a qualification at the end of the process with an EMA SME number, and the SME status is valid for 2 years and needs to be renewed before it expires. To decide if a company is an SME, we take into account the size and the ownership of the company, and we apply the EU SME definition that has been laid out in a Commission recommendation. So an SME is a company that has less than 250 employees and that has either not more than 50 million euros as annual turnover or not more than 43 million euros as balance sheet total. Depending on the size of the company, also we subcategorize them into micro, medium, or small enterprise, and this is important because depending on the size of the company, then the incentives can be different. The incentives that I'm going to to explain in the next slides. So as of today, we have a bit less than 2,000 companies registered with us, and 23% of them have declared that they are developing orphan products. So the regulatory assistance, so this is something that is available for SMEs and academia at the EMA level. So I'll start with the regulatory assistance by the SME office. So we have an inbox, an email, and a helpline where we can address any administrative, regulatory, or procedural queries from SME, and we reply either by email or phone directly. We can interact with colleagues from the EMA internally to address your questions, and we can decide to set up meetings if we think it's relevant. I've listed some example of topics addressed here. So it goes from the SME definition and incentives, protocol assistance, scientific advice, orphan designation, prime, any regulatory topics, pediatric requirements. So these are the most common questions, but we can address any type of question. We also have an entry point for academia, so it addresses the needs of medicines developers from the academic sector, and it aims to facilitate communication with them. They can be contacted via email, and the same principle applies. They can assist you with any question you may have, help you navigate the regulatory framework for pharmaceuticals, and set up meetings if needed. The SME briefing meeting, so this is something that is specific for SME and is part of the regulatory assistance. So if we see that the question needs a meeting, then we set up this meeting, which is a platform for early dialogue. It's a multidisciplinary group from the EMA, so depending on the question, we invite different people from the EMA. We discuss the regulatory strategy of medicinal product development within this platform, and we navigate the range of procedures and incentives available. This is free of charge. The main topics covered, I've listed them here. Usually we have questions on scientific advice, regulatory and procedural aspects, orphan drug designations, pediatric requirements, prime eligibility. We have a lot of these companies coming for rare diseases, and the majority of them come at an early stage of development, but we can also set it up later in the development. So in 2020, so far, we had 10 meetings like that, and 4 of them covered orphan aspects, and we will have more before the end of the year. So now we are going to talk about the fee incentives, which is something that is important as well. And you know that there is a fee for most of the procedures at EMA, but there are specific benefits for SME and academia and for orphan designated product. So I will now hand over to my colleague Rosan from the academia office, who will explain to you a bit more and will raise these questions. Rosan?
Thank you very much, Helene. So it's now time for some interactive questions. So I kindly ask you to grab your phones for the following 3 quiz questions. And the first question is, what are the costs for protocol assistance for an SME developing an orphan designated product? Is that indeed the first question, Helene?
I think Fred is doing it for us.
Because you should be seeing the Slido poll on screen now. So in your Slido app, you will see the question pop up now. I can see now that 71 have filled in the question. Is it possible for you to show the Slido app again, Helene? Yes, there it is. So this is indeed the first.
This is the second
question
one.
we're now. Yeah, this is the second one indeed.
We have. This one is the first one.
Okay. So.
No. Okay, I can't do anything about it. Sorry. This is the second one. We're going to go for the second one now. Sorry.
Okay, so what are the costs for protocol assistance for an SME developing an orphan designated product? You can see the timer there in the top of your screen, so you still have a couple of seconds to respond to this. So at the EMA, there are fee incentives that are applied for SMEs, so this could give you a hint in the right direction. 10 more seconds to go, so please vote. I was hoping I was able to give you the right answer. That was €0 as SMEs get 100% fee reduction for designated orphan products. But moving on to the next one, what are the costs for protocol? Sorry, it's not running as we rehearsed this. Apologies for that. I think it's...
No,
yeah, so let's go for this one. Mm-hmm. What are the costs for protocol assistance for an academic developing an orphan and designated product? So again, a couple of seconds, and apologies, it's not running exactly as we had foreseen. So normally when a sponsor is requesting scientific advice on the clinical development of a product, there are costs associated. If they extend it also to safety and quality issues additional to scientific advice, the price would increase. But for academia, upon receipt of an orphan designation, an academic developing an orphan product will be waived for fees, and the so-called protocol assistant will be free of charge. So I'm already pointing you towards the right answer, just to make sure that we have addressed this before we move on to the next question. And then yes, so that was the right answer indeed. Moving on to the last question. I will hand over back to you, Helene. I think that that will be better. Thank you.
So as my colleague Rosan mentioned, so if you are an SME and you request protocol assistance, so which is the scientific advice for designated orphan product, then you're going to have 100% fee reduction, and the same applies for academia. Something that is interesting also to know is that if you are an SME that apply for marketing authorization for an orphan designated product, then it's for free. You don't have to pay anything. There are also some incentives for post-authorization procedures for orphan designated product and SME for the first year after the marketing authorization. And you can also have fee incentives for SMEs for inspection and pharmacovigilance activities and MEDRA registration. So this is something really important for companies. I've put a link to the full detail on fee incentives at the bottom of the slide for your convenience. But there are also other incentives than the regulatory assistance and financial fee incentives. So the SME office, we facilitate access to regulatory information by organizing info day, writing our SME newsletter, sending targeting mailings and announcements. We also have the SME user guide, which is a kind of a digest of the EMA procedures and that explains what needs to be done to have a marketing authorization. We also engage with EU bodies and industry stakeholders, and for companies that are at the stage of marketing authorization, we provide the translation of the product information for the initial marketing authorization into all EU official languages, and it's free of charge, which is a big incentive for companies in terms of time and money. Let's talk now about the EMA support to innovation. So this slide summarizes the tools available at EMA throughout the development of a product until the marketing authorization application and the different possibilities to interact with EMA. So I've talked about the SME office, about the academia entry point. You've had a presentation on the orphan drug designation. I'll go in the next slide through the ITF, the scientific advice, and the PRIME scheme. Something I wanted to highlight here, and I won't further detail, is the ATMP certification for SMEs that is available. So SMEs can submit to EMA the results of studies carried out to demonstrate the quality and non-clinical safety of ATMP and request evaluation and certification of the data, which should help and ease any upcoming clinical trial application or marketing authorization based on the same data. Let's talk about the ITF now. So the ITF is a multidisciplinary group within the EMA that works in cooperation with EMA's working parties. It's a forum for early dialogue with applicants on anything that's innovative. It brings together scientific, legal, and regulatory expertise for emerging therapies, novel technologies, and borderline products. So in 2019, we had 29 ITF briefing meetings for human products, 13 were for SMEs and 8 were for academia. So that represents 72% of ITF briefing meetings, so it's quite a lot. And the EU Innovation Network, I wanted to mention it here because it has been set up to strengthen the cooperation between the national innovation offices and EMA. The national innovation offices were involved in the ITF before, but we decided to set up this network to make the regulatory support for medicines developers that is available at EU and national level even more visible for developers. Let's talk now about scientific advice and protocol assistance. So as you know, protocol assistance is the scientific advice for designated orphan medicinal product. And what I wanted to show on this slide is if you have a look at the chart at the bar for 2019, you will see that for protocol assistance, 33% of the procedures finalized were for SMEs. So it's a third of the procedures. So it's quite a lot. And for SMEs. The prime scheme now, so I won't go too much into the details here because you're going to have a presentation on that a bit later, but it's for new human medicines with major public interests that fosters development, facilitates timely access to patients, and there is an early entry point for SMEs and academia at the proof of principle stage. In terms of figures, there's a high interest by SMEs. Around 50% of products in the prime scheme are from SME developers. Few SMEs were granted early entry into the prime scheme since the launch in 2016. And the SME success rate of application for prime is around 25%, which is a bit less than for other developers that are more around 30%. The field most represented, we have a lot of rare diseases and ATMP. For academia, there were only 4 requests since the launch and no prime eligibility granted so far. Now I'm going to finalize the presentation by giving some tips and recommendations for you. So the first one is to look for guidance. The EMA website is full of information. When you're developing a product, it can be interesting to have a look at the European Public Assessment Report of already authorized product to get a nice source of regulatory and scientific aspects. There is specific support for you, as I've explained today, for SMEs and academia, but also for orphan designated products, including fee incentives and regulatory assistance. And then the very last point here is something that you might have heard already before, but is to come early and often to make use of all this support that is available at EMA level, because it will maximize your chance of success then in the marketing authorization application process. So thank you very much for your attention. Now I will give the floor to Virginie. Virginie Hivert works for EURDIS, the European umbrella of rare diseases patient organization. She's involved with EMA both with the COMP and with the PRAC, the Pharmacovigilance Committee. She's also the vice chair of ERDIC Therapies Scientific Committee, and she will give now a presentation about the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook. I hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Helene. Good morning to everyone. So as Helene was saying, what I would like to show you this morning is the outcome of something we have developed within IRDiRC, so the International Rare Disease Research Consortium, in order to help facilitating the development of rare disease therapy. So this work has been conducted within the Therapy Scientific Committee of EJP under the leadership of Diego Ardigo, who is the chair of this committee, and myself. So just a few words on EJP. This consortium, this international consortium, has been officially launched almost 10 years ago. There was a joint impulsion from the European Commission and the NIH in the US, and precisely with this idea of creating a research network of research funders to help accelerate the medical breakthrough for people living with rare disease. And 10 years later, the network has hugely expanded with a lot of funding organizations, both public and private, but also the expansion of the number of umbrella of patient organizations that are involved in this consortium. So in terms of therapies, the goals that IRDiRC set for itself back in 2011, that was to have overall in all regions of the globe 200 new therapy by the year 2020. And in fact, this was achieved already in 2017. And so IRDiRC reflect and came up with a new goal that you have on the screen that will be to obtain by 2027 new therapies, 1,000 new therapies for rare disease, and the majority of which to be focused on disease without approved option at the time. So that's when that's where we started with the Therapy Scientific Committee. Considering the current rate of drug development, the current rate of approval per year, considering as well that, as it has been mentioned previously by the other speakers, we are far from having all the rare diseases with an approved treatment or even with an ongoing therapeutic development. We came with this idea that a real change was needed, a real change in the drug development model and ecosystem for rare disease. So that's why we set for the TSC roadmap to support the definition of a new master plan for the development and for the registration of innovative drug for rare diseases. So we really stem from the idea that there are a lot out there, also as it has been presented this morning, there are a lot of tools, but maybe what we needed, what will help as well to better use this tool is to provide a structured framework and some recommendation on how to navigate the ecosystem. So that's how we came to this idea of this orphan drug development guidebook that will be patient-focused, that will gather the available tools, the available incentive resources, practices for the development of therapies for rare disease, and also how to best use them and when to best use them in the development plan. And this guidebook, from the beginning, we were really working on it, willing to address all type of stakeholders, all types of developers, from academia, non-profit organization, small and larger biotechs. And so all types of drug developers that are representing the audience of today as well. Okay, good. So this project span over 2 years, a bit more than 2 years. And here you have the key features of what we did actually to develop this guidebook. So what we did is together group of experts in drug development from various stakeholders' origins. And we worked before and after the organization of a workshop that has really been key for the development of the recommendation. We presented the group of experts with a milestone-based drug development framework, a game board that I will introduce to you in a minute, also with building blocks, case scenarios, and what was the objective was to use those building blocks that I will also present to you across the different phases and the different milestones of the development, precisely to issue this recommendation, this roadmap and checklist on what to do and when to do it. Yes, so this is the framework. So what we have done is that we have represented the development path has a circle, starting with the patient needs and ending with the patient needs. So we've put on this circle the different milestones that are the different step within the development. You will recognize them from the knowledge about the disease, from the identification of target and product discovery, all through the phase of preclinical and clinical development, and until the authorization, and back to patient care and patient needs. And I keep trying to move the slides to say that unfortunately this, oops, it has gone a bit too fast, but that's fine. Unfortunately, we had to focus exclusively on medicinal products. So this guidebook is not addressing medical device for the moment, but we are working on it. We had to make choices, so it didn't address at the moment as well the repurposing approaches or line extension, only the first aspect of drug development. But we wanted, as I said, to have it really sponsor. Oops, sorry, it's disturbing to have the slide moving. But we wanted it to have less sponsor-centric and really focus on the need of the patient. And because we were addressing all regions of the world from US, Japan, Europe. So we've grouped all these concepts of HTA reimbursement that are really EU specific into market access. So all the post-approval phases have been grouped as market access. And as you will see later, for the ease of the representation of the recommendation, we have also presented this development path as an arrow, like you can see at the bottom of the screen, so that it is more easy to visualize it. Thank you. Okay, so I think maybe that's easier if you continue like that, because okay, so just to say that then to use this framework, we have identified, like I said, building blocks. We have identified more than 100 building blocks. And for each of them, we've created a fact sheet that was describing the relevance for the rare disease drug development, the availability of these building blocks, the scope of use, the pros and cons of its usage, and the best time to apply it during the development path. And what we call building blocks are really regulatory tools. So, for example, everything that has been described previously from the designation and incentive was included in the building block list. Also, some building blocks addressing HTA reimbursement, some addressing early access in the different regions of the world, because the legislation are a bit different, and also the identification of development practices and development resources. So if I go on to the next slide, please. Yeah. So we have defined as well, to use this framework, to use the building blocks, 3 case studies. The first one is the quite standard of drug development with a traditional, well-understood pharmaceutical. And we were considering for this case study that in this case, we had a considerable body of knowledge already available for the diseases, and that, well, the patient population was quite well understood, quite well known, and that the disease was present in children and adults. And if you maybe go on to the next 2 click, you can see the 2 next, one more click, thank you, the 2 next case study that we have designed for this workshop of experts. So the second one, advanced therapy, presented the same characteristic than the previous one, but only with the difference, I mean, there's not a slight difference, that in this case, we were considering the development of TMP, so either gene therapy, either cell therapy, for example. So in that case, less understood technology. And the third case was even more difficult, because in that third case, we were considering disregarded diseases. So these neglected diseases that were mentioned by Violeta at the beginning of this morning, for example, with a very ultra-rare disease, with very few knowledge on disease, very few information on the natural history study, biomarkers, or any other feature related to the disease, also a disease that was existing only in pediatric patients. And all these case studies basically were to help us to address as well when those building blocks could be used in the different cases that we see in the real life of therapeutic development. If I can have the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just to show you in real how we did that. So on the table, the group of experts had this framework, this drug development path. They were presented with this list of building blocks, and they have really worked on those case studies in order to identify where they would have used the different building blocks within each of the different case studies. So that was, if you go on the next slide, really where we did derive the recommendation from. So everything I've explained to you very quickly this morning has been published in this paper in Nature Review Drug Discovery, from the methodology that we use, the list of building blocks, the explanation on the framework, and also the recommendation. And it is also, if you go on the next slide, thank you. So it is also, if I go a bit more into details, presented in various representation. So here is an example. For sake of time, I will go rather quickly, but what was really striking with the recommendation from the group of experts is that a lot of the building blocks we identified have to be used at the very beginning of the development. So basically, it might sound obvious, but you have to make sure when you start a development that you have the key elements that are already positioned or foreseen at the beginning. So that's how we came with this start checklist, which is featuring the stakeholder mapping, the available information on the disease, the financial resources, and target patient value profile for the whole development, focusing on the patient needs. And so if you get to use this START checklist, you will have to look at the different questions. For example, are there patient organizations, are there community advisory board, etc. And then, in fact, the building blocks are the answer. For example, here we have a building block that is explaining what is CAB, what is this community advisory board. If we go on to the next slide, I can show you another type of representation that we have derived from our recommendation. This is a Gantt-like chart, which is in fact really very crowded slide, but just to show you that we've tried to, based on this framework that is presenting as a line, we've tried to put all the building blocks and all the recommendations for the 3 case study within black, the standard orphan drug development. In orange, the one with the advanced therapy, and in green, the one for the disregarded disease. So it's a bit an addition for it when the cases is becoming even more difficult to address. Then you have more building blocks, more tools that you can use. And the graphical representation is really showing you with the arrow the time frame when you can use these building blocks. So, for example, if you look at the very top of the slide, you have this ITF that Helene mentioned just a minute ago, with a time window where you can use the ITF, but also dot picturing when the group of experts identified the best time to apply for the innovation task force. So if you can go a slide further, just also to say that all this information, and I guess you can click maybe 3 times, all this information are freely accessible to all the developers, thank you, on the IRDiRC website. Because it's a bit dry, maybe to look at it like that, we have developed a video tutorial which is explaining in much more details what I showed to you today, this checklist to start the development, this recommendation in the Gantt-like style, with also the distinction between the different case studies. And in addition to the tutorial, we have also developed an interactive website. And I don't know if we have time or if we technically we can go now just for 1 second the interactive website, but otherwise, okay, I see no time. So otherwise, I will let you have a look at this website. How to use the website is also mentioned in the video tutorial, and don't hesitate to contact me if you have any question. And then I will finish on my last slide. Okay. So just to say that all these materials, all these recommendations that we have included in the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook, you can use that as an expert platform resource. So you can use all the building blocks independently, download them independently, really a bit like a Wikipedia resources. We also foreseen that you can use the framework and the workshops like style to for educational purposes. You can use the game board and the building blocks for your own training. You can use it as well for planning your strategic development. So we've already had some example of organizations that have used the guidebook to elicit a real case scenario for reflecting on a real development plan. And last but not least, we wanted to ensure the long-term sustainability of this guidebook, and we are now working with the European Joint Programme on Rare Disease so that it is also uptaken on their platform. And I thank you very much.
The next section is dedicated to the pre-marketing incentives for development of orphan medicines. The first speaker of this session is Armando Magrelli. He is the vice chair of the COMP and a COMP member representing Italy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all. It's a very pleasure to be here today. And as I will try to introduce you some of the tools or the regulatory tools which are currently used at the European level and which needs to be highlighted to some extent and also to be, let's say, analyzed after some time of having in place. And to some extent, I will try to introduce you some of the regulatory tools that we are currently using the European Medicine Agency. Okay, as many of you already know, there is a long route to bring medicine to patients, and as you can see, the timing is quite long. Sometimes years pass through, but what is important for our purposes today is to try to understand which are the regulatory provision which target different aspects of the medicine during the development. So one is the provision which are aimed at targeting the time to access the market, and I'm speaking about the conditional marketing authorization, accelerated assessment, and also compassionate use. And on the other side, we have regulatory provision which are targeting the risk of developmental failure or how to avoid the risk. And we are talking about scientific advice, the SMA support, and also other provision. This is the standard timetable for a marketing authorization. As you can see, is a 210 days long, but as you already know, the timing is usually longer. We are about 400 days or something like that. But this is just to give you the idea which are the provisions that are in place. And this is the classical timing. If we want to have a look to the early access tool, we have different tools in place which are actually a way to better use what is already in the regulations and in the directives. So we have the PRIME, which is a scheme that we will see in a few slides. We have the accelerated assessment, which regards an unmet medical need, a major public health interest, and usually the accelerated assessment is about 150 days. We have the conditional marketing authorization, again, it's possible to apply a conditional marketing authorization in where is highlighted an unmet medical need for seriously debilitating disease or life-threatening, as frequently applied to rare disease. And also we have other tools such as the adaptive pathway and exceptional circumstances. And what I would like to highlight here is also the fact, as mentioned before, that patients have active roles in many of these processes, in this early access tool, let's say, as you can see in the parallel advice, in the adaptive pathway, also in PRIME, we will see in a while. If we want to just to give you a brief introduction, in the case of accelerated assessment, as I told you, which is a procedure intended to be with a timing of 150 days, what has been clear during the process, and as you can see on the left right of the graph, roughly the 50% of the requests for accelerated assessment were accepted, and of which only half of these are completed and were completed under accelerated timelines. And this is due mainly for the fact that the dossier were not enough robust to maintain the accelerated assessment. And as highlighted on the right side, there are many aspects which, let's say, downgrade to a normal timeline, which are GCP issues, GMP issues, or also clinical objection and so on. But this is just to tell you that sometimes it's very important to make a robust decision, is important to have a robust package. And as well as if we consider the conditional marketing authorization, if you look at the procedures that in the last years use the conditional marketing authorization, you can see that only those which are submitted as conditional marketing authorization had a timing which was acceptable on the right lower hand, you can see, but other procedures were proposed during the assessment to go for a conditional due to the uncertainties in the dossier. So this is, again, highlighting the fact that it's important to have early dialogue with the EMA, and also important to have some flexibility during the development of the medicine. I'm going a bit fast, but we will open to save some time. And with regard to scientific advice and protocol assistance, as mentioned before, remember that scientific advice and protocol assistance are the same procedures. The difference resides on the fact that protocol assistance is intended for orphan designated products. And the scientific advice, in principle, is an advice given in a prospective way. It's more focusing on the developmental strategy rather than to assess the data. This is important because this is the early tools. And the procedures, the scientific advice and the protocol assistance are procedures that are usually takes about 70 days at maximum, with the possibility to have a short advice in 40 days. And there are very, very many aspects that can be addressed in a scientific advice procedures. One is the classical way to ask for advice for issues regarding quality, non-clinical or clinical aspect of the product, but there are also the possibility to interact in parallel with other competent authorities such as the FDA or the WHO, or also try to have advice with the HTA bodies or payers or patient organization and academics. This is another way of having advice. And also there is a possibility which is more important, especially in the early phase of the development, to have an advice and an opinion on the qualification of novel methodology or biomarkers. This is also another important aspect which covers some of the needs from academics that discover new biomarkers or new possibility to assess possible outcomes or endpoints. So, and also there are advice in the post-marketing setting and advice with regard to the pediatric development, and also the possibility to have other advice in terms of regulatory strategy and so on. But what is important in the advice is that it's not legally binding, obviously, but what's clear since some years now, if you look at the data on products which receive scientific advice, you can easily see that the compliance with the advice gave a better percentage of success of on the marketing authorization, and this is quite obvious because obviously let's say the needs from the regulators have been already addressed during the scientific advice, so it's to some extent is more streamlined the process, and the results of this analysis that was 2-3 years ago was the higher success rate, less major objection, and actually a shorter period to reach the mark. As well as I mentioned, there is a possibility also to ask for a parallel advice in which the EMA and, for example, HTA can sit in the same table, and question can be addressed specifically from each part of the regulators, from a marketing authorization perspective, but also from a payer perspective. So in the same table, you can have feedback from payers, so HTA bodies, and also EMA side. These are the numbers that you already seen as a general from the previous speaker, showing how many and how is growing the scientific advice and protocol-assisted procedures along the years. And you can see now in 2019, we have more than 600 procedures, and roughly 130 are protocol assistant, which regards specifically orphan drugs. And it's important also to highlight that in 2019, we had 11 qualification of novel methodology. And 11 were from SMEs out of 16 in 2019. Here is the summary of what's the scientific advice address. On the right side, you can see the number of questions raised during these years. As you can see, are distributed in the clinical, quality, and non-clinical part. And in the left side, you can see the different kind of requests addressed by different stakeholders. We have the parallel advice with the international regulators. We have the joint scientific advice with the HTA and the PRIME that we will see in a moment, and then the request of qualification on our methodology. And now we arrived to the PRIME scheme. Actually, the PRIME scheme is aimed to bring innovative medicine to patients faster by optimizing the use of what is already in place and supporting the development of medicine. The PRIME scheme was starting in 2016, and actually as I already mentioned, is built on the current framework, and also it's the eligibility to the PRIME scheme is according to the accelerated assessment criteria. So these are actually the main aims of and goal of the PRIME. Actually, the PRIME is aimed to facilitate an early interaction and also to focus an efficient development. So trying to drive the development in the correct, let's say, way, or in the correct needs for producing robust data. This is the classical scheme of the prime overview, in which you can see the two entry points, the early development and the later development, in which for the scheme, SMEs and academia are also allowed to present at the early stage, while other sponsors can submit for eligibility at the later stage. What is important in the prime scheme is to identify the unmet medical needs, and also finally you will have the accelerated assessment. In principle, the prime scheme is an iterative scientific advice. What does it mean? It means that you can go through multiple scientific advice. You have a kickoff meeting during the start of the procedures, and then you have a repetitive or iterative scientific advice along your process as well. As soon as you have new data, you can come back and ask to how to proceed with your development. And this is a very proactive dialogue. And as you can see in the timeline, we also have an early CHMP rapporteur appointment, which is quite important in terms of the assessment. So what is important to be eligible to the prime scheme? It's important to highlight the unmet medical needs, which means to provide the epidemiological data on the disease, to describe the disease in terms of prevention, treatment, standard of care, and how the medical needs is not fulfilled, and then how the products could address these unmet medical needs, and so also the clinical relevance of the product. These data can be required at different stages, obviously, but the principle to highlight for the eligibility, the unmet medical need, and the principle that your product is addressing these unmet medical needs, it's one of the eligibility criteria. This is the timeline. The assessment for the eligibility to the prime scheme is a 40-day procedure. So as you can see, you have the application request, the SOP review, together with the EMA, the application. There is a date 30 discussion, the scientific advice working party. In case you are developing an advanced therapy, there is also the involvement of the Committee for Advanced Therapy, and at day 40 you have the outcome letter from the CHMP of accepting or rejecting the eligibility. Here are the numbers since the 2016 of the requested for eligibility in the prime scheme. Out of more than 300 procedures, we are roughly in 80 products on the prime scheme. As you can see, the majority of the products are in the oncological field, but we also have on the neurological field and so on. And what is quite important is also the fact that SMEs have a good number of products in the prime scheme compared to other. We only have actually no academics, so at least not directly academics in the prime scheme. Here, what I already mentioned, we received about 310 requests for eligibility in the prime. And as you can see, roughly the 80% of the products in the prime are for rare diseases. And roughly also, roughly the 40% of those are advanced therapy. So as I mentioned before, the prime products, once are in the scheme, they receive an enhanced support from the agency with kickoff meeting, scientific advice with meeting, obviously, and then inputs from multiple committee, ranking from CAT if needed, PETCO or COMP, and also input from other stakeholders such as patients and STA bodies. This is just to highlight you what are the observation and experience that we gain in the eligibility part, and which are the main issue that we had in these 4 years. So one issue was regarding the difficulties in quantify and understand the unmet medical needs, and which also was connected to the potential to address the medical need, because sometimes we assess pharmacological data versus clinical data, and sometimes it's very difficult to translate in addressing an unmet medical need. And also other issue highlighted during these years was that sometimes the relevance of the proof of principle presented was not particularly fitted, and another aspect was the fact that the stage of development was the other issue. So if was for many of those were too early, and for other were too late. This means that if you came for a scientific advice too late, obviously there are no advice which can be given at a later stage, as well as at the early stage. Maybe it's difficult to draw a proper advice in the early stages. And so we also highlight some difficulties with competitors, and also obviously identify safety issues that need to be addressed. So just to summarize, the idea of the PRIME scheme is to strengthen the support to medicine that target unmet medical needs. And this medicine should offer a major therapeutic advantage over existing treatment, or with patients who have no treatment option. And this go through a proactive and scientific support from the HEMA to optimize the generation of data which are robust for the accelerated assessment, hoping that this will bring new medicine to patients as fast as possible, or as early as possible. And just to mention as a final remark, this is the PRIME webpage where you can find all the information, and also you can directly contact the PRIME office. And if PRIME is not the right tool, don't worry. The EMA can still provide support through different other scheme or tools, which already had this morning, which are the EU Innovation Network, the Innovation Task Force, the SME Office, the Scientific Advice Office, and all the other possibilities already mentioned. And I think that I would thank you all for your attention. I want to thank the COMP members, SOAP colleagues, and EMA colleagues. Thank you, and I will pass the floor to Daria Julkowska, which is a scientific coordinator of the European Program on Rare Disease at INSERM, and Assistant Director of Thematic Institute, the GGB, and will talk about funding scheme in the EU.
Thank you very much, Armando. Thank you very much to all the organizers. So I'm going to present today the current funding schemes and also the support schemes that are developed under the European Joint Program on Rare Diseases, and I'm going to touch also upon very shortly about what are maybe the possibilities of funding under Horizon Europe. presentation of what the European Joint Programme on Rare Diseases is. So first of all, in terms of the objectives, the objective of the program really is to create a rare diseases ecosystem, so a research and innovation pipeline from bench to bedside that ensures rapid translation of research results into clinical applications and uptake in healthcare for benefit of patients. And so the idea is here really to bring different types of stakeholders under one umbrella, to take the advantage of what we already have, to expand it, to develop new dedicated tools, and of course to facilitate the rare diseases research with the benefit of patients at the end. Okay, so this is just to show you what the EJP RD actually covers in terms of the partners. So we have more than 80 partners plus 50 linked third parties, meaning that about 130 institutions from 35 countries participate in the EJP RD, and many of them, like the European reference networks, but also the European research infrastructures or EuroOrdis, are themselves a big networks, which means that altogether EJP RD covers funding organizations, research institutes, universities, hospitals, charities and foundations, and of course patient organizations, altogether representing more than 85% of the European rare disease community. So this is very quickly just to talk about the structure, which is, at the end, reflects also the different types of services and support that we are providing. So the program is organized, of course, around the coordination and so-called transversal activities, but then the rest of the activities is organized into 4 what we called pillars. The first one focusing on different funding support schemes. The second one, which is building the virtual platform of rare diseases tools, services, and data. The third one focusing on the capacity building and empowerment. And finally, the last one focuses on the acceleration of translation of research results and therapy development. What the EJP RD can do for you. So let me start with what we call joint transnational calls. So EJP RD is actually launching, and this is something that we picked up from the previous already multinational scheme that was called Hivert. So we are launching joint transnational calls for research projects. So this should be a multinational research project. The calls are being launched once a year, every year at the end of the year. So the current one call was already pre-announced, and I will give you just a little bit of information about this. So what are the main characteristics that apply to all of those calls, but let's say some slight modifications may be done every year. So always it is a 2-stage evaluation process where in the first stage you have to submit a short pre-proposal, and then after the first evaluation you are being invited to submit your full proposals. The pre-proposal submission stage is always open for at least 16 days. We offer also a rebuttal stage that is included in the full proposal evaluation, meaning that the projects that submitted the full proposals will receive the comments of the evaluators and will have the possibility to respond to them. What is very important is that it is a support for multinational research projects, meaning that you have to be at least 3 partners, 3 research teams, and a maximum of 6 per project, with some possibility of extensions. We strongly encourage the involvement of so-called underrepresented countries. That can be EU 13 countries, but it can also specifically extend to some other countries like Turkey, for example, or even sometimes Luxembourg can be considered as underrepresented. We also encourage very strongly the involvement of patient advocacy and organizations, and provide also funding for patient advocacy organizations. And of course, what is interesting is that these projects, even though that the process is common, so we evaluate all together, actually you are signing contract with your national funding bodies, which quite often facilitates the process for the national teams. And in terms of the success rate, you have in the first stage, so where you submit this first proposal, usually the success rate is between 10 to 12%. However, if you go to the second stage, if you are invited to the second stage, your chance to get funded is between 35 to 50%. So the current joint transnational call is very special, I would say, because of the fact that it is the first time that we are launching a multinational call on social sciences and humanities. And I think it can be, of course, of interest for you because it really focuses on very broadly on different types of research. So it covers health and social care services. It covers also the economic impact of rare diseases. It can cover psychological and social impact of rare diseases, the studies that address impact, the burden of the delay in diagnosis, the lack of therapeutic intervention. It also covers e-health in rare diseases, but also the health outcome research methods that you can develop to measure rare diseases impact. And well, obviously, we could not also miss the fact about the effects of the pandemic crisis, but it's really focusing on the way to respond in the rare diseases field and the emergence of the innovative care pathways in this regard. So the call will open officially in December. The submission, the pre-proposal submission deadline is in February 2021. And of course, you can find all the information on our website that you will find also at the end of this presentation. The other currently open call that we are offering is the one for innovative statistical methodologies to improve rare disease clinical trials in limited populations. And this is what we call an internal call for projects. Why is it called internal call for projects? Because of the fact that actually it is open to EJP RD beneficiaries. But as you have seen on my previous slide, the EJP beneficiaries, it's really a very large let's say, definition. So don't hesitate also to go and check if your institution is involved in the EJP RD, and especially if you are a member of the European reference network. It's not because of the fact that there is only the coordinating institution of the ERNs that is involved in the EJP RD, that other institutions that are part of the ERNs cannot participate in this call. So the aim into this call is really to develop innovative statistical methodologies that address unmet needs that are associated to the development and analysis of clinical trials in limited populations. So we are really talking here about, let's say, a specific niche that cannot be tackled with a traditional, let's say, statistical methodologies and traditional clinical approach to the clinical trials. Again, the call is going to open in December. And we also foresee a networking matchmaking event that will be organized on 11th of January. It will be, of course, online, so you can, again, find all the information on our website. Okay, other types of support. If you are looking for example, gathering of experts and patients to discuss and share knowledge, or you would like to expand your network to include new stakeholders, or even if you are looking to gather a consortium to prepare and to apply it to the future European Commission call. Then we also have what we call the support networking scheme. And so this scheme is open. It's not to finance research, it's really to finance networking. And I can tell you that despite of the fact that in the current situation, we do not meet face to face, it doesn't mean that the scheme is not open, meaning that we adapted it to the needs, so we can also finance let's say the meetings or events that you would like to organize online. This support scheme is open all year long, and we have every 3 months we have a collection date where we collect all the applications, evaluate them, and then provide the funding. You can apply for up to 30,000 euros. Of course, the goal here is really to share the knowledge, to share, to bring together different types of stakeholders. So the next collection date is actually tomorrow. So, but you can of course apply to it and then profit from the next evaluation that will be in March. If you are interested in training your PhD students or young MD and within your European reference networks or within other European reference networks, then we also have a so-called Research Mobility Fellowship Scheme. So this is specifically developed for the European reference networks, and it means also that so it is for a short term stays that can go up to 3 months, and it means that actually if you are developing a common project or you would like to train your PhD or your MD PhD or possibly also a postdoc, then it means that you can apply to the scheme. It's quite simple. The deadline for submission of the last one has just closed, but the next one should open at the beginning of the next year. And it really, let's say, it's targeted to boost the sharing of knowledge and the trainings within the European reference networks. We also have a similar type in case if you are interested in sharing of transversal type of knowledge that goes beyond the European reference networks, and to propose training workshops. So this is again a scheme that is dedicated to, let's say, it is to target the knowledge of the European reference networks, but again, any member of the EJP RD, so any institution of the EJP RD can apply to this, can propose a training that of course has to tackle or target the specific needs of the European reference networks. And here you have 25,000 euros for which per event for which you can apply, and the next call should open at the beginning of the next year. Finally, I think it's also important to underline that we have other training possibilities. So if you are interested in specific trainings, the EJP RD has different types of trainings that are being offered, the trainings that span from data management and quality, but also through the patient and researchers trainings to the education academic course. So please don't hesitate to go on our website and see. These are all for free. You just need to register, and of course the number of places are limited. So often there is, let's say, some kind of selection process. You have to justify why this training would be an added value for you or your team, your institution. But we all year long there are different types of trainings that are proposed. And the two last services that I would like to present is the first one is related to, let's say, boosting the translation of research results. So if you are looking, for example, to evaluate the translational potential of your project, or an advice on how to get interest of potential sponsor or to de-risk your project. We have a dedicated support office, which is composed of two elements. The first one is the innovation management toolbox that is currently, should be published soon. And for example, the Orphan drug development guide will be also featured through this innovation management toolbox. And the other one is a direct support, where we have a pool of mentors that support translation and innovation. We do it together with the European research infrastructures, EJP, but also our colleagues from Italian Teleton who are specialized in this. And so the idea is that you can come and we can help in assessing your translational needs. So it is, let's say, primary. It was opened to EJP RD partners and European reference networks, but again, we are also accepting other types of, let's say, requests based on the evaluation and the feasibility of the request. And the final service that I would like to present is the one in terms that focuses on the multinational clinical trials. So again, here we collaborate together with the European infrastructures ECRIN that is dedicated to support multinational clinical trials. We have a clinical trials support office. Obviously, it focuses very much on academic clinical trials, because these are the ones that most often need some additional support. So of course, we do not reinvent the wheel. So we do not replace the services like that could, or let's say, advice that could be provided by EMA. But the idea is, to have a pool of, again, a pool of mentors, a pool of experts that can help you in arranging or in the management of your or preparation of your multinational clinical trials. So these are the different contacts in terms of EJP RD. We also have a help desk that actually you can access directly from our website. So don't hesitate to go there. We really respond to any types of requests and questions. And so in my last two slides, I just would like to present a very fast the funding opportunities that you may find under Horizon Europe. please take note that I'm not a representative of the European Commission, so this is the information, of course, that I could gather also from the perspective of somebody, who is, let's say, outside but follows very closely and let's say has some experience in the different types of calls of the European Commission. So as you know, of course, this is the preliminary structure of the Horizon Europe, and what is the most interesting, at least I would say, at least for you, are the pillars 1 and pillar 2. The pillar 1 being the bottom-up and the pillar 2 being the top-down with the specific topics that are being identified. I would like to just direct your attention to a very interesting funding schemes that you may not want to be or use as a primary or think of as a primary source of funding, because indeed they are bottom up, but actually they are very interesting, and you can have a lot of let's say, support through those. And the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, you have different types of funding. So you have the individual fellowships, which are focused on the experienced researchers. So it is really about developing a research project between a specific researcher and the research lab, which I think for the rare diseases community, it can be very interesting. The other type of support is that are more dedicated to institutions, are Marie Skłodowska-Curie co-fund actions, ITN actions, and rights actions. So this is more targeting the institutions, meaning that, for example, if several institutions are interested or already developed international or multinational training program, they can take advantage of this kind of support. It can be also, especially for the Marie Skłodowska-Curie ITN actions, you can bring different institutions together where you have a pool of PhD students that you will train together into a specific topic that can be, of course, the rare diseases. And finally, the Marie Skłodowska-Rise, which are focused really on the short-term exchanges for personnel between academia and industrial and commercial organizations, which can be also very valuable for rare diseases field, and especially collaboration in terms of drug development. And finally, the last one is really about the Horizon Europe Health Work Program. So I'm not going to give you any details on this because this is still being under development, but I just would like to attract your attention that this the Horizon Europe is, of course, very much, let's say, focused on innovation, but also on bringing together different aspects and a special, let's say, social aspects. So there are several missions also that are around that are foreseen. It has to be fit for digital age. So here we always have a for the majority of the calls, we have a top-down approach, meaning that topics are predefined. The current work program is still under development. You can have different types of approach, 1 or 2 steps evaluation procedures with different types of actions, research and innovation projects, the coordination support actions, partnerships, and so on. What is important, I think, for you is that there will be quite few topics that will be rare diseases specific. For example, the development of the effective therapies for rare diseases with unmet medical needs. But the majority of the topics, they are not rare disease specific, but can be valuable and can be open, of course, also to the rare diseases community, with some exceptions where it is really written clearly that, for example, it has to focus on the disorders with a high prevalence. So, of course, you have the link here, the link to the portal where you can find all the information, also from the and hopefully soon the publications of the new calls from Horizon Europe. So, thank you very much.
Good morning. It is 11:45, and I hope that you have been able to grab a cup of coffee or tea. We are back now for session 3 of our workshop, and this session is dedicated to the stakeholders' perspective. So we will hear 3 different presentations, but it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Juan Antonio Bueren, who is head of the Division of Hematopoietic Innovative Therapies at CMAT and Cyber of Rare Disease. Dr. Bueren is also coordinator of the Mixed Unit of Advanced Therapies, CMAT ICE Jimenez Diaz Foundation, and also consultant of Rocket Pharmaceuticals. He currently serves as Vice President of the European Society of Cell and Gene Therapy. With this introduction of someone with a lot of different functions, I'm very happy to give you the floor, Juan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Violeta. Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present the perspective of an academic institution such as the CIVERER. Okay, first of all, what's CIVERER? CIVERER is one of the consortia from the Carlos III Health Institute here in Spain, which acts as a national reference and also coordinates and fosters research in rare diseases. It has a cooperative network structure, which is composed by 78 research groups, which are located in the main research institutions in Spain, and more than 700 people participate in this institution, which is devoted to the investigation of different rare diseases. The aim of the institute is the generation of new scientific knowledge to understand the biological basis and also to improve the diagnosis and develop new therapies for rare diseases. Okay, what's the CIVERER experience with orphan drug designations? As shown in the slide, CIVERER has sponsored 10 different orphan drugs in Europe, and 4 of them have also been granted by the FDA. 4 of these drugs are advanced therapies. In fact, they are gene therapy products, 3 of which are based on the lentiviral vector-mediated gene therapy of hematopoietic stem cells, and these are used for the treatment of patients with Fanconi's anemia, with patients with pyruvate kinase deficiency, and leukocyte adhesion deficiency type 1, which is a primary immunodeficiency. And very recently, we have been granted for the treatment of patients with epidermolysis bullosa by means of a gene editing approach using the CRISPR-Cas technology, using autologous skin equivalent grafts. And all the remaining products are repurposing drugs for the treatment of adrenoleukodystrophy, 2 of them, 2 others for the treatment of squamous cell carcinomas from patients with Fanconi anemia, and also for the treatment of Lafora disease and the primary coenzyme Q10 deficiency syndrome. Which were some of the significant benefits that we observed from getting an orphan drug designation? Well, the first point that needs to be taken into account is that having an ODD is something that is affordable for an academic group, because it can be supported by experimental, non-clinical in vitro and in vivo data. So non-clinical data, non-clinical data is enough for obtaining the orphan drug designation, mainly having demonstration, a clear demonstration of efficacy, as opposed to other therapies that are nowadays approved for the treatment of the disease. And some of the added value that we have seen is that there is an evident increase of visibility to stakeholders, access to specific funding, also attraction from industries, and improved relationship with patients' associations, as well as additional benefits that have been already presented in this workshop. In terms of difficulties, In meetings with other teams from the CBRR, we agreed that determinations of prevalence have been particularly difficult for, at least for some of us. So in this respect, it would be really very helpful if EMA could provide access to information about prevalence in rare diseases where there are already approved orphan drugs for the treatment of the same disease. And also, it could be useful to simplify the procedure of evaluation, the prevalence in those diseases in which the estimation of the prevalence is clearly below the threshold of 5 in 10,000. And also, it's quite evident that determinations of prevalence in recently discovered rare diseases is very complex because there is no information in databases and in publications, and therefore at least something like a provisional application until it would be possible to make a better estimation of the prevalence could be really welcome from us. Okay, while some time ago we had the opportunity to apply to specific grants which were only to orphan drug designations, so far as we know, there are no specific national European calls for products that have been granted as orphan drugs. And indeed, we should recognize our limited knowledge in terms of regulatory issues related with drug development for rare diseases. So specific training, and indeed in collaboration with the STARS program, should be performed. Well, because I've been also asked to present an example, a case study, I will present the first the disease in which we obtained our first orphan drug designation. This is Fanconi anemia, and in particular, the development of a lentiviral vector that was developed for the gene correction of hematopoietic stem cells from affected patients. And we have already treated 9 patients with genetically modified cells, and it was of particular relevance that because we demonstrated in preclinical studies that multipotent hematopoietic stem cells from these patients develop a proliferation advantage over uncorrected cells as a consequence of the genetic correction with this lentiviral vector. We, in this first trial, we intended the engraftment of patients in the absence of any drug, any chemotherapy, nor radiotherapy treatment as the one that is of routine use after allogenic transplantation. And of interest is the observation that after a delay of a few months after infusion, a progressive increase in the proportion of genetically corrected cells in peripheral blood were observed in patients that were treated with threshold numbers of gene-corrected cells. So, for example, in this patient, more than 60% of peripheral blood cells are now gene-corrected in the absence of any conditioning. And these cells show that in contrast to the observation that there is a high proportion of cells with chromosomal aberrations, spontaneously the number of unstable lymphocytes is decreased even after the exposure to genotoxic drugs such as the epoxybutane. And the most significant observation is that despite the progressive progression of the bone marrow failure before gene therapy, after gene therapy there is stabilization or even improvement in some hematopoietic cell lineages. So these are a number of achievements that we obtained after being granted by the EMA with the orphan drug designation for this lentiviral vector. As shown in the slide, 1 year after, we could apply to a call that was specific for ODDs in Spain, 1 year later in Europe. And thanks to these projects, it was possible to open in Spain a phase 1/2 gene therapy trial. And additionally, at this time, we obtained the designation, an ODD, from the US. In 2016, we treated the first patient, and at this time, we licensed our lentiviral vector to a US company, Rocket Pharma, that was created 1 year earlier. And a couple of years afterwards, we had the meeting with the EMA for the protocol assistance. The protocol was also approved by the FDA, and here in Spain, it was approved the phase 2 trial. And again, in the States, it was obtained the regenerative medicine advanced therapy and fast track designation. All this now under the sponsorship of the company. And finally, in 2019, we treated the last patient of the phase 1/2 clinical trial in Spain, and the global trial was initiated in Stanford. And finally, also under the sponsorship of Rocket, we obtained the prime designation by the EMA. So a few suggestions under our point of view for improvement. We realize that we need an early interaction with regulators. We also think that regulatory requirements should be closer to us, and therefore training activities should be promoted, and most probably regulatory issues such as specific milestones related with orphan drug applications should be considered as part of the project plans in programs approved by national and European programs. So to conclude, we understand that having an ODD designation is a great opportunity for academic groups. We need early interaction with European regulators. We need improved collaboration between industry and academic researchers, because it is known by all of us that many transformative drugs have emerged in publicly funded academic teams being further developed by public and private partnerships. So as a kind of take-home message, the future of patients suffering from rare diseases will depend on improved knowledge of the disease, the better diagnosis, and the development of new therapeutic options. And that efficient interactions between academic teams and the industry are essential to reach all these goals. And with this, I conclude my presentation. And now I would like to introduce to all of you to Dr. Andrea Braun-Scherhag, who is Vice President and Head of Regulatory Affairs in Europe at a former SME, Ultragenics. And today she will speak on behalf of UCOPE, which is the Associating Europe Small to Medium-Sized Innovative Companies working in the fields of pharmaceuticals and medical technologies. Andrea?
Thank you very much, Juan. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak on behalf of the SMEs. I'll give you the SMEs perspective today with regards to the value of the orphan designation. And we know all, right, that there's very many people in the EU suffering from a rare disease, 30 million, and orphan drug designations and orphan medicinal products play a key role in this perspective. And I mean, there's very many patients currently still underserved out of these 30 million. And we will really like to provide better treatment and care for those, the ones with the rare diseases. And what is particularly challenging also from our point of view are the ones with ultra rare diseases. So currently there's over 1,700 orphan drug designations in the EU. And in the meantime, with the legislation being implemented, and we have heard quite a bit about that already, over 140 orphan medicinal products are authorized in the EU. So the question is that enough with all those orphan drug designations, or is that perhaps not yet enough? And what could be realistically expected? So I think the good news is really that with over 1,700 orphan drug designations in the EU, there is a lot of research ongoing, and over 140 orphan medicinal products being approved is already a big step forward. And I think, we could see in the last years that we have increased numbers of orphan medicinal products approved. So considering the long development timelines for orphan medicinal products, basically, I really think those numbers will increase further in the next years. I think we have two people here. Oh, okay. So the rare diseases, really, how do they look like? They're often really highly heterogeneous in the clinical manifestations, right? And I compare them a little bit to the elephant with the 7 blind, described by 7 blind men. One of them thinks it's a wall, the other thinks it's a rope. And that's also how we look at the rare diseases. Basically, rare diseases are often not really well described in literature. There's often really not sufficient scientific knowledge available, sometimes even a slightly wrong perspective, perhaps regarding the natural history. And also there's very heterogeneous clinical manifestations. So sometimes the eyes are impacted, the ears, the skeleton, movement in the skeleton. So it's very, very broad. And every rare disease is really different. So every rare disease is a different animal, right? And for ultra rare diseases, you do not even have 7 blind men describing them, but perhaps less, perhaps only 3. Orphan drug development is challenging, right? We know it. Drug development itself is already challenging, but orphan drug development is even more challenging through what I have just discussed before. And what is really very, very important is the recognition of a rare disease through an orphan drug designation. What is specific then about the rare disease development program? Often you have smaller trials because you just do not have as many patients which you can recruit. They might be shorter or there might be less studies. And you often have innovative designs. And sometimes you do have single-arm studies also only because just it's unethical, for example, to have a comparative trial. You always grapple also with the feasibility to conduct those trials because you might have been really optimistic initially and saying, yes, we can clearly recruit those patients, but then reality has hit you and basically you could not even recruit those patients you thought you could. So feasibility is of key importance for the recruitment of the studies, and also therefore it would be really important if natural history data are available, that those can be used also to, for example, support the development. So to say, when we have single-arm studies, that they can provide the comparator arm. That would be important. And then another aspect is really, it is very, very important to involve the patient systematically into the drug development, particularly for rare diseases, because the patients themselves or the caregivers know most about the specific rare disease, for example, for patient-reported outcome development. And what is also key is, of course, to involve the HTA bodies because on the long run, the products, should be brought to the market, and the marketing authorization, the EMA, is very important, but also the next steps where the HTA bodies are, of course, key. For an approval, you might want to consider a conditional authorization or exceptional circumstances authorization. And if we continue, what is the value then of an orphan drug designation, right? So clearly the orphan drug designation is of high value. Absolutely, one can say that, because that is not only for the company itself, but also for the investment community, which is important for companies and specifically for SMEs, because it implies also a relatively faster development. And the orphan drug designation is basically the precondition for a development of the orphan medicinal products. It makes absolutely clear that there is an unmet medical need which should be addressed. Often for patients with debilitating or life-threatening disease, there's an EU harmonized approach for the orphan drug designation, and this is really also of high value, that not each and every country has its own requirements, but we have really an EU harmonized approach for the orphan drug designations. And then there is, of course, also incentives. That was already covered by some speakers. That's why I'm going to go over that only shortly. Those incentives during drug development for orphan medicinal products. So reduced fees for the protocol assistance, minus 70% for pediatric advice, even for free. MAA filing costs are reduced by 10%, and inspection fees are also waived. And what is of key importance really for industry is the 10 years of market exclusivity. If we move ahead then, so what is really the value of the orphan drug designation, and particularly for the SMEs? The SMEs, to the SMEs, everything I said before applies, of course, but in addition, the SMEs benefit from even further reduction of costs for the orphan medicinal products, meaning scientific advice or protocol assistance is completely for free, MAA submissions are for free, and inspection fees pre-authorization are for free. And this is very good news. The SME office was also discussed before, that's why I keep that brief. It's a very valuable additional resource, and they can really help the SMEs support and guide. So my recommendation would be really consult the SME office. They really help you. Also, when we were SMEs, they really helped us for the submission of our first MAA, which was proving very, very, very valuable. And then why should an SME actually, if you move one back, why should an SME actually consult EU regulators during development? Isn't that just really cumbersome, and you get a lot of input which you might not want at all? I actually think that that's the contrary. We have those challenging rare diseases, right? And often SMEs do not or have all the knowledge necessarily in-house. And that's why it is very, very important to discuss with the regulators already during the development, as early as possible, as Juan alluded to really make the development program at an early stage fit for the approval. Because if one does not do that, it can be much more cumbersome thereafter. And it's really helpful, for example, very, very important discussions are endpoints, where the regulators can help really a lot to define the endpoints. And that has really a very, very high value for the development program and helps the SME to anticipate the requirements for the MAA. On the next slide, I'm going to walk you briefly through the challenges and room for improvement within the legal framework as we see it. So we see actually increased requirements for orphan drug designations in the last years, and also including significant benefit. It is very much a challenge for a small company to have a development program which is supposed to be small and needs to be small. We have because there's only a few patients, and nevertheless align all the various EMA committees on this one development package, which is often just one trial, because you have only few studies and very few patients. And with that, one needs to satisfy all stakeholders' requirements. And what is really helpful if there is really specific patient expertise for the exact disease in the committees and in the scientific advice working party. Therefore, it would be really helpful if it could be globally aligned, that the pediatric requirements could be globally aligned for orphan medicinal products. And also currently for the orphan drug designations, there are still differing requirements. Even there, it would be perhaps helpful to consider a global alignment. Of course, research incentives have been discussed and would be really helpful. And what is always a challenge already for the challenge rare disease development is if you then on top of it have a drug device combination. Also improved involvement of specific patient expertise from the regulator's perspective, but also for the HTAs would be really, really important, because the HTAs in fact have additional requirements due to the different mandates in comparison to the regulators. So this is a very small case study. What is the challenges for an orphan or ultra-orphan drug when you look at HTA bodies? We are looking at a heterogeneous disease, often with less than 100 patients in the EU. And what is required is nevertheless a comparative randomized clinical studies from an HTA perspective. But for ultra-rare diseases, there's just often no comparator. And the standard of care is very, very diverse. And this presents a huge challenge, and therefore one has often single-arm studies. And therefore it would be very helpful if one could move towards an agreement across stakeholders to accept real-world evidence as also an acceptable methodology for indirect comparisons if one has single studies. On the other hand, the next challenge is, of course, the patient population itself being extremely small, and sometimes the requirements are larger, on the other hand. And the same thing applies to the clinical outcomes. The request is for robust clinical outcomes as a primary endpoint, but on the other hand, the very heterogeneous and small patient population is there due to the variable disease manifestation and also progression. And unfortunately, there is sometimes no clinically robust primary endpoint for the whole population due to variable disease manifestations. And instead, one has various potential endpoints which would qualify only for a subset of patients. So the patient-relevant outcomes move towards a better acceptability from an HTA perspective, and also biomarkers instead of a robust clinical outcomes, because they are just often not possible. So how to foster development of rare diseases, of medicines in rare diseases, right? Please keep the concept of the orphan drug development, because I think that is very, very good concept. For ultra-rare diseases, the current concept is even a challenge. And to keep the orphan drug development concept is also really very helpful to provide a stable and positive environment also for sustainability for small and medium-sized companies. I would therefore, in addition, propose to incentivize research and development further, which is currently existing. And there have been already great examples been presented, lead collaboration with the ERNs, increase the value of the real-world evidence, also for regulatory decision-making and also beyond, and support the integrated pathway for orphan drug device combination products. And also importantly, and finally, support HTA understanding of orphan medicinal products specific requirements from the patient and the disease perspective. With that, I would like to thank EMA very much. And I would like to now introduce Nick Sireau. He's the chair and the CEO of the AKU Society, a patient group working on ultra-rare genetic disease alkaptonuria, or AKU for short, which affects both his children. Nick has been working on developing a treatment called nitisinone for AKU for the past 17 years, culminating in a European Commission granting the marketing approval for nitisinone for AKU in October this year. Over to you, Nick.
Great, thank you very much. So yes, I am Nick. I am the chair and CEO of the AKU Society, which works on the ultra-rare disease alkaptonuria. And we are a patient group based in the UK, but which also works worldwide. So over the next 15 minutes, what I'm going to do is explain to you a bit the journey that we've been over the past 17 years, but particularly from orphan designation to marketing approval, which happened last month when the European Commission granted marketing approval for the drug nitisinone to treat AKU. So this is Sir Archibald Garrod, who in 1902 first described alkaptonuria, or AKU, as an inborn error of metabolism. And that was really the first time anybody had shown that a disease could be inherited. And it was the birth of kind of inherited metabolic diseases, of which now we know of hundreds of them. So it has a place in all the medical history books. Here you see our oldest known patient, an Egyptian mummy from 1500 BC, and you can see the blackness on the mummy, which is characteristic of the blackness that you get in AKU, which is why it's called also black bone disease or black urine disease. This is the clinical characteristics of AKU. You can see the black urine in the top right, the black blue in the ears, the black spots in the eyes, and in the bottom right, that is an elbow joint of someone with AKU at a post-mortem, and you can see there that the elbow joint is completely black. This is the urine of someone treated with the drug nitisinone, and as you can see, it gets clearer as time progresses. And this is the metabolic pathway, and it's important to know this because at each stage of the metabolic pathway, you have a different metabolic disease. Phenylketonuria, PKU at the top. This is the breakdown of tyrosine, and then you get albinism, just one down. Bottom left, you get tyrosinemia type 1, which is an ultra-rare disease that kills children by age 2 through liver cancer. And then there you have alkaptonuria due to a deficiency of the enzyme homogentisate 1,2-dioxygenase. And this leads to an increase of a product called homogentisic acid, which is in the red box, at 2,000 times the normal rate. And that homogentisic acid binds to cartilage and bone and goes black in a process called opranosis. And that's what leads to the damage. And here you have the drug nitisinone, originally a weed killer that was then redeveloped for tyrosinemia. It works very well for tyrosinemia. The children on the drug are still alive 30 years later, and which also we believed could work for alkaptonuria because it's an enzyme inhibitor and stops the production of the acid. So the value of orphan designation. So this was the orphan designation for nitisinone, 6th of January 2003, which was submitted by the company Swedish Orphan International, now known as SOBI, to really start research into alkaptonuria, okay? And then what happened is there was a drug trial at the National Institutes of Health in the US from 2006 to 2009 on 40 patients, which unfortunately failed for a number of reasons. One, there weren't enough patients. Two, they only looked at a single endpoint, which was hip rotation. And three, it didn't last long enough, only lasted 3 years. So we were all pretty devastated. And that's why we then decided in Europe, under the leadership of Professor Ranganathan at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital, to do a series of clinical trials, much larger ones, to really show that this drug worked. So we did a series of 3 trials. Now, before I go into this, what we first had to do was preclinical studies. We did a lot of that. That was funded by us, the AKU Society. We set up an animal model, a mouse model of the disease. And when we fed nitisinone to the mice at birth, they showed no symptoms of the disease. And when we gave it halfway through life, it completely halted the evolution of the disease. So biochemically and preclinically, we knew that it worked. We then put together a consortium of 12 different organizations, including the pharma company Sobi, a CRO called PSR, who are experts in orphan drug designation, under the leadership of Professor Ranganathan at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital. And we applied to the European Commission for the Framework Protocol 7 funding in 2011-2012. And out of 540 applications, we actually came top with a score of 15 out of 15, which allowed us to secure 6 million euros in funding. And then on top of that, we secured another 5 million in co-financing. And we could apply to the FP7 program because we had orphan designation. You had to have orphan designation for that particular drug if you wanted to apply. And that's what enabled us to apply for this grant. And without this grant, we'd have struggled to make this work. And these are the 3 studies. The first one, SONIA 1, suitability of nitisinone in alkaptonuria 1, was a 3-month phase 2 study in the UK and Slovakia. In the UK, because that's where the leading centre was under Professor Ranganathan, and in Slovakia, because there are many more patients there, whilst in most of the world, it's 1 in 500,000 have AKU. In Slovakia, it's 1 in 19,000. And then we did SONIA 2, suitability of nitisinone in alkaptonuria 2, a 4-year phase 3 study in the UK, Slovakia, and France, where we had a clinical trial centre at the Hôpital Necker in Paris. And then the third study, SOPHIA, subclinical ochronosis features in alkaptonuria, was to detect at what age we needed to start treating. This is the consortium, as you can see, 3 clinical sites, 2 patient groups, the AKU site in UK and ALCAP set up in France by my parents, regulatory and monitoring, so Sobi as a full partner along with PSR, and then the analysis at University of Liverpool under Professor Jim Gallagher, the University of Siena, Nordic Bioscience, who did the biomarker analysis, and the Slovak Academy of Science, who did all the gene mutation analysis. And this was the whole consortium, or representatives of the consortium, at our last meeting in Siena in January 2019. And then in July 2019, the data was analysed by Professor Ranganathan and the team at Sobi, and it was seen to have statistical significance. Okay, this was the SONIA 1 study, 0 milligrams, 1, 2, 4, and 8 milligrams. And as you can see, the 8 milligram dose came tops by reducing homogentisic acid by 99.4%, which is absolutely incredible, an incredibly powerful drug. This is SONIA 2, nitisinone, 70 on, 70 off the drug. In the end, we recruited 69 and 69, 138 in 9 months, which was really much a feat. And we had gone to see the European Medicines Agency in November 2012 before doing these trials for scientific advice, again allowed by the orphan drug designation. And the EMA scientific advice was that we should use the homogentisic acid as a primary endpoint, which was fantastic, but that we should show a positive trend in the clinical outcomes that we had at secondary endpoints, including the AKU Severity Score Index, which we had developed through our own funding as a composite endpoint that looked at all the parts of the body affected by AKU. And these are the 3 clinical trial sites, Liverpool, Slovakia, and Paris. And this is a SOPHIA study, so looking at 2 men, 2 women, at every age from age 16, and we discovered some ochronosis, that's some black pigment from age 16, which is why we treat from age 16 in the UK. So as I said, statistical significance was reached in the AKU Severity Score Index, as well as showing the homogentisic acid reduced by more than 99%. In September of this year, the European Medicines Agency provided a positive opinion. And then in October, the EC granted marketing authorization, which was all absolutely fantastic and could be traced back to that orphan designation in 2003. So the result of 17 years of work. Now, a little bit about the challenges and opportunities. One is the funding obstacles. I think particularly in rare diseases where there's not so much a commercial imperative, there is a need for funding schemes such as the one provided by the European Commission in FP7 and Horizon 2020. And I would encourage the EC to actually increase the amount of funding available. because at the moment, or at least when we were doing it, there were hundreds and hundreds of applications and only 10 or 15 were successful. And yet many others were still very good. So there is a need for more funding, but also from national governments. I think there is a need for more funding on the scale that we see here. So it's very difficult to get the funding, but without that funding, it would be even more difficult. And the reason for that is nitazoxanide came off patent 3 years ago. So Sobi actually had no commercial imperative to develop this drug because they knew they would not make any profit out of it. And yet they still did it out of philanthropic reasons because it lined up with their values, because they had could supply the drug through the clinical trials, but also because of this public-private kind of partnership that we had. Endpoint questions were really important. For that, the EMA scientific advice was absolutely crucial in helping us really define the endpoints for the clinical studies. As I said, working in pharma was really important. So the fact that Sobi had this orphan drug designation, but the fact that as a patient group, we arrived having set up a consortium, having done all the preclinical research with the team in Liverpool and all that, and really working as equal partners. The next challenge was setting up a consortium. It's not easy, but we found the secret to really working consortium was that for 8 years, every Thursday morning at 9:30 a.m. UK time, apart from between Christmas and New Year, we had a teleconference with all members of the consortium discussing what needed to happen over the next week to make sure that the clinical trials worked well. And that was crucial. And then finally, identifying and recruiting rare disease patients. I spent 1 year with Professor Ranganathan in 2013, traveling all around Europe and the Middle East to Jordan to help set up local patient groups and to help recruit them into the clinical study. So that's it really. If you want to contact me for more, my email is nick@akuSociety.org. But I want to say thank you for this workshop and thank you for inviting me to speak. Thank you.
So in the wrap-up, which I will try to do in the reasonable time that we have with Michael, I would like to say a few things. One is about the participation. So if you can go to the next slide, please, you will see again the affiliation of our participants. And indeed, as the workshop was intended for SMEs in academia, I think we have quite a number of participants from these two groups, but not excluding, of course, participants from patients, from ERNs, healthcare professionals and consultants. Since the poll was running slightly longer, you can see that in the end we have, of course, people who joined also from some distant countries. And as was discussed in the Q&A sessions, it might be very useful for sponsors who are outside of EU also to listen to this and to know what can be done or what is possible within the European system. Maybe, yes. It is just a very brief summary of the topics which we covered today. And of course, the first one was about the support available. And maybe just to remind everyone that the steps for an orphan designation, you can find them in many documents, and maybe they were explained again in more detail today. The support which one can receive at the EMA, as indicated in the second graph here, is at numerous different steps. And I think that after having listened to the presentation today, one may find it a bit easier to approach the different offices which might support you in this development. The guidebook, as presented by Virginie, and here is just an example how this can go. It is very small, not intended to be read, but just to remind you that it is another very interesting and very promising initiative how one can navigate in a system which is quite complicated. In the next slide, which is about the second session, what we have heard today is that there are several incentives which can be used, both from the regulators and from the different funding sources as presented by Armando and by Daria. And the interesting message here is try to use these incentives in the most efficient way, meaning interact with regulators where appropriate and whenever it is the right time to do that. And also I think there are more funding options that one can imagine. I was listening very carefully to Daria's presentation, and I think it is very interesting to see that there are different opportunities which I hope can be used in a better way, especially for academics. Now, going to the session with our stakeholders, which I think from the regulator's point of view, this is the next slide, please. Something went wrong with this slide, but I will summarize it anyway. So what is important for us is to hear indeed what are the difficulties. And I think we can summarize them in a few big groups. One is indeed, there are several aspects which are very useful, as we heard from all three speakers. But there are also a few where I heard several times comments. Now, one was the prevalence and message taken. I think it is a very important issue on one hand because the sources of information can be very limited, especially for some ultra-rare diseases, and there the suggestion to publish already previous decisions could be interesting. On the other hand, there is always the need for some update because we have seen that in certain disease areas, new publications appear, and then this can change the figure either upwards or downwards. But it is a difficult and problematic criteria. We know that very well. Another one, which I really liked the illustration of Andrea with the elephant, is indeed the condition. And it is not just to understand the condition so that one can find better treatment options. It is also to identify it, and also for patients who want to belong to a certain group. But this is sometimes quite contradictory because there are different opinions out there among scientists, patients, academics, and we have to consider all this. Now, what we heard from Nick was also that sometimes it is like speaking different languages. So let's try to speak the same language. And the example provided indeed showed a very successful story, but still there is room for improvement. As we heard, if dedicated workshops can be performed or other ways of communication, in addition to the summer school for patient representatives, which is going on for many years now. And in this respect, EJP has contributed a lot to bringing closer patient communities to the regulatory system. In conclusion, I would like just to say that tomorrow, the Committee of Orphan Medicinal Products has the first day of its monthly plenary meeting, and we will be briefly discussing the topics of this workshop, the outcomes, the questions that we heard, and the discussions that we had. And in addition to that, we will have a report in which some more questions will be answered. So with this, I would like to say a big thank you to everyone who expressed interest and registered and followed this workshop, to our supportive staff who was running this meeting remotely with just a few people physically in the EMA building and everyone else connected from different locations. To our speakers who spent time presenting, but also preparing for this event. And of course, with this, I would like to hand over to Michael, who has a few closing remarks as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Violeta. This has been an extremely insightful event, and we have set out to engage with the communities that are at the forefront of medicines development in rare and neglected diseases to facilitate early and efficient interaction between developers and European regulators. And I would say the multi-stakeholder approach has allowed us to learn from different perspectives and practical examples regarding orphan development support, pre-marketing incentives, and stakeholders' perspectives on orphan designation. My thanks go to all the speakers and panelists who have shared their views and experiences. This was paramount to achieve our goal. And I would like to thank Violeta Stoyanova-Beninska for guiding us through the workshop and all the work by the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Product that she's chairing. And particularly, I would like to recognize two EMA colleagues without whom today's workshop would not have been possible. Maria Sheehan, who drove the scoping and preparation of the workshop and guided all speakers throughout today's event, and Frédéric Dubois, who supported the running of this virtual workshop. Thanks to all of you involved. Such virtual events may have challenges, but they also have a significant benefit. They allow connecting far more individuals from across regions, as you've seen today. And as mentioned, we have collected your feedback and input and will carry this forward post-event. EMA is committed to work with stakeholders in the interest of patients affected by rare diseases. And with this, I would like to conclude the main part of this event. Thanks to all for participating. After the lunch break, there is the IRIS Clinic to get further insight into this new submission and workflow platform. And I should say, this is not only relevant for orphan designations, but also, since a few weeks now, for scientific advice and for other procedures in the future. So I can only recommend participating into this clinic and into the insights you will be given there. But for now, all I can say is have a good week, stay safe, and take care. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paolo Tomasi, and I am the IRIS product owner, which means I represent the users, and that includes EMA users, the network users, but also the industry users in the system. And my role is to make sure that our developers create something that satisfies the needs of everyone. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the of how to register for IRIS, first of all, and then how to request a research product identifier, which is actually one of the procedures, just one of the procedures that you can have in IRIS. There's plenty of guidance, and we don't have time for a full course. I will take, in fact, a bit more than the 15 minutes that are marked in the agenda. It will take me about half an hour to go through the slides. Now, okay, oops, sorry. So there will be an overview. Then I will say something about the integrated systems that IRIS uses, the account management portal, the organization management system, and the substance management systems in SPOR, and then the RPI and the other submissions that are directly done in IRIS. And finally, I will show you where you can find further guidance and seek support if the guidance doesn't answer your questions. The objectives are that at the end of this session, you will understand what you need to do to connect to IRIS for the first time and submit your application. You will know where to find guidance, you understand the concept of the RPI, and you can submit an application via IRIS. One important aspect to keep in mind is that most of the challenges that you might find with the system are not with IRIS itself, but with the registration that does not actually occur in IRIS. It's a different system, and we will see why it's important to make the difference afterwards. But the good news is that you need to do the registration only once, and once it's done, you can submit applications, and you do not need to repeat the registration, and you can submit different types of applications through the system. So what is IRIS? It's a platform to manage procedures, cases, products, regulatory entitlements at the European Medicines Agency. And it's composed of four main, how can I say, websites, really, because it's an online system, it lives in the cloud. And so these four are actually four websites, if you wish. The first one is the one that we will briefly see today. It's the submission platform, which is accessed by industry and other type of applicants, even individual applicants access it. And I like to think of it as a bit Amazon for the agency, whereby you have an online system where you can directly input the data instead of filling in PDF forms and then sending them via URLink or the gateway or any other system. You just input the data directly into the portal. You can attach documents, like a scientific document, for example, with the actual support of the application. You can view your ongoing submissions and those that have been completed as well. The system also has the advantage that it allows you to see some data already pre-populated by the system when you make a reference to existing regulatory entitlements, for example, a previous orphan designation. It will populate automatically the RPI for you and other relevant information for your submission. The benefits for the applicants, for industry and individual applicants, is not just industry, it's also individual applicants, particularly a consideration for orphan submissions, is that there is a single portal. The scientific submissions look very similar between, for example, orphan designation and scientific advice. They really look very similar. You save time because you use the same credentials for all the applications carried out by IRDiRC, and currently it's orphan designation, innovation task force meeting, scientific advice, and more to come. I mentioned already the pre-populated data. You can check the status of the applications and the documents online in real time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you can do that from multiple different devices. Your PC, certainly, but also your phone or your tablet. The portal works out of the box in these different formats. And there's also security, because the documents are directly uploaded into a portal, not sent via email or UDRA-link, which is less secure. And once they are there, the documents reside in that portal, and they're actually not sent to the assessment team, the various committee members, but they are just shared with them in the portal. They have a different portal, of course. So what you need to do before you can submit an application into IRDiRC, where the first time you do it, there's a number of things that you may need to do. For example, if your organization is not an OMS, then you have to do that to register it. You have to request an EMA account for yourself as a user, if you don't have one already. And then you need to ask affiliation to the organization that you want to represent, that you are applying on behalf of, again, in a different EMA system, IAM, that I mentioned here. If your procedure is scientific advice, but not for orphan designations, you also need a customer number for the invoices. But orphan designations do not have a fee, so that part does not affect you. And if you intend to submit an application for what is, in effect, a new substance, which is not included in the UTCT SMS list of approved and current substances, then you will also have to request registration of that new substance. But all of these things have to be done only once. Let's see them briefly. Now, to register a new organization in OMS, you need to log in not to IRDiRC, but to the OMS portal and create a change request to register it. Chances are that your organization already exists, unless it's very new. Because, of course, the organization list is a single one. It's master data that contains thousands of organizations already. All of these processes, of course, is mentioned in the registration guide in section 4. The links, you can find them in the slides here. Now, after your organization is registered, you need a username, you need an account for yourself as a person in the system. The chances are you already have it, because if you have used UDRA-link in the past, you have an access already. Now, the system needs to know to allow you to submit an application, who you are, do you have a EMA account, which organization do you represent, that needs to be registered in OMS, and which type of role do you have on behalf of that organization. All of this is managed in the EMA account management portal, not in IRDiRC. That is a different software. As I mentioned, if you have a UDRA-link account or a UDRA-Vigilance account, you probably have, you have already an EMA account. You can go on the EMA account management portal, IAM, and you can click, not sure if you have an EMA account, if you're not sure, and the system will tell you based on your email address. If you do not have the account, you can create it in the same portal. And there, when you create the account, you'll be immediately asked if you want an IRDiRC individual user role. Tick yes, and you'll be enabled already to create submissions in IRDiRC as an individual. You receive a confirmation of that. On the other hand, if you want to be able to create a submission on behalf of an organization, you need to request affiliation to that organization and specify the role that you want to have. Currently, basically, the choice is only manager or contributor. These have different powers, so to speak. Now, the interesting part is that you can be affiliated to more than one organization, not necessarily all your own employer. If, for example, you work for a consultancy, then you may have affiliations to different organizations for which you are providing services. How can you find out if your organization is already recorded in OMS, in the SPOR section, in the OMS section of SPOR? Well, there's actually 3 ways to do that, because the same database is integrated and copied in different places. You can do so, you can check directly in IRIS if you wish. The list of registered organizations is on the homepage of IRIS. You click on the public registers and lists, and then you can find there the organizations. Of course, you can do it also in the SPOR portal. That's just another interface to the same data. But probably the simplest thing is when you request affiliation, you, in the account management portal, you will see there the list of the organizations. If yours doesn't appear, it means it has to be requested for insertion into OMS. The customer account number, I think we'll skip this because, as I mentioned, is only necessary for scientific advice and protocol assistance applications, however, which are also for orphan designations. But for a scientific advice and protocol assistance application, a customer account number is needed also if there is no fee. If there is a 0 fee, it's still needed to provide a customer account number to the application. Now, let's say your substance is very new. So you don't have an RPI for it, but actually there isn't even a substance registered in UTCT as approved, authorized and current. Authorized doesn't mean that the product is authorized, of course. It means that the substance has been approved by the EMA stewards. And a point here is that the substance may exist in UTCT, but it may not be authorized yet because it comes from a different list of research substances that was used in the past, and therefore it needs to be approved by the EMA stewards of the Substance Management System, SMS, also a part of SPOR. The procedure is listed here, but basically to register a new substance, what is required is an EMA service desk request with a specific form. It's an Excel file. It's linked here. You can actually click on this and you'll get the Excel file. And of course, you should also add any supporting documentation, for example, either the investigations brochure, the section A3 medical plausibility of the OD, the substance specifications. Bear in mind that insertion of a new substance in SMS and therefore in IRIS, because the two are integrated, may require currently up to 10 working days. So it pays to do it in advance of the, well in advance of the submission deadline for the orphan procedure that you intend to present. So the good news is that all of these registration steps that I just showed you are only needed once for the first submission. And the bad news is none, of course, because IRIS is simple. Now, you've done all that. How do you log in? Well, you go to the IRIS website, IRIS EMA Europa EU. You click on sign in, either here on the big blue button or on top right in the other sign in, it's the same. Then you put your EMA username followed by @ID EMA Europa EU, for example, like this, in Jones A ID EMA Europa EU, and you enter your password. To create a new submission, you would go to Submissions, Draft Submissions. I'm sorry, it's not shown here, but when you click on Submissions on the top, you will see a menu with Draft Submissions, Ongoing Submissions, and Completed Submissions. You click on Draft Submissions because this is where you find this button, the blue button, Create New Submission. Let's say, for example, that you have to create a submission for a research product. Now, the IRIS system will not automatically approve your request for an RPI because this is reviewed and approved by the European Medicines Agency, because the main check that is done is that the RPI does not already exist. And because an RPI follows a product across the life cycle, including changes of sponsor, it's possible that the RPI does exist, but is assigned to another sponsor because, let's say, you're now a new consultant, or a consultant created the previous submission, and now the actual developer of the product is creating the submission. So in these cases, a new RPI will not be created because the product already exists in the agency system, and there will be a need to transfer the RPI from the existing sponsor to the new one, so that the new sponsor can actually see the RPI and create submissions based on it. But let's say your RPI doesn't exist at all. It's a very new substance. You've never come to the agency with it, and therefore there's a need for a new RPI to be created. Now, you can, of course, only create the RPI once the substance has been registered in the list, as I've just shown you before. And to further explain what an RPI is, I've put some concepts here in this slide, because from previous meetings we had, this turned out to be a concept not entirely clear to all participants. So a research product identifier, or RPI, is a development concept, and it can apply to what is only a potential new medicinal product, of which we do not know the excipients, we only know the active substance or substances. But it also applies to existing authorized products, because they're all related to an RPI in the IRDiRC system. But an RPI is a concept that can be also applied to more than an individual medicinal product. For example, and particularly for ITF briefing meetings, Innovation Task Force briefing meetings, and for scientific advice, we can have RPIs that apply to methodologies, technologies, or potentially even multiple medicinal products in the same class, of which only some will be probably followed for development. The principle of management of the RPI is that whenever a development product is transferred to another developer, and this happens frequently in the early phases of a product development in the life cycle, the RPI remains the same. It is transferred to the new sponsor. All the centrally authorized products are associated to an RPI in IRDiRC, and bear in mind, however, that a generic of a product has a different RPI because it's a different development. A final aspect in the principle is that the veterinary RPIs are separate from the human ones. So if a company is developing the same product, the same substance, in fact, or a combination of substances, both for human and veterinary use, they will have two different RPIs, one for human use, one for veterinary use. The RPI is needed to be mentioned explicitly for most types of scientific procedures in IRDiRC, for orphan designations, ITF, scientific advice, etc. However, if the procedure that is an annual report, for example, then you would mention the orphan designation you're referring to, and that orphan designation is already linked with to an RPI, so the system will not ask you the RPI because the system already knows it. And in fact, it should be possible to change it because the annual report is referred to that particular orphan designation with already an RPI. So, I've put here a list, a potpourri of frequently asked questions and aspects about IRDiRC submissions that I think need to be highlighted individually. When you create a draft submission in the system, it remains as such a draft submission until you actually submit it. You click on Declare and Submit, and there's a procedure for that. When you do so, a case is created, procedure is created. The EMA is aware that you have asked for the submission to proceed, and the timeline is applied. That's how the system works. Most submissions, well, not RPI requests, for example, but most submissions allow to upload documents, of course, and the recommendation here is not to use zip files, but to upload individual documents, with one exception. For references, lists of 10, 15, 25, 56 references are probably best included in a single PDF file, or if that is not possible, in a zip file. The application, the submission that you see on the right, has sections in blue, and all of the mandatory sections must be completed. So you see the right tick on the right, that tells us that a section has been completed. And you can only save a section if it is completed. Once you've saved a section, you can leave your draft submission and go back at a later time, but to save a section, you need to complete it all. Once all are completed, you can declare and submit the application, first the declaration, then submit the application. Bear in mind that once the submission is actually submitted, pardon the pun, your documents are locked. So you cannot add new documents to the submission once it's submitted, unless the European Medicines Agency reopens the submission for you to upload new documents, additional documents. And that has a deadline. So you're given some time to upload document, after which the submission will close itself automatically. A crucial aspect of the system is that you will receive emails from the system. They are always sent by the same address, EMA IRDiRC, and therefore you may want to whitelist it or send it with a route to an appropriate folder. But the important point is that when you send an email to the agency about an existing procedure, a case, you always reply to an existing email from the same case, because that way the system will reroute the email to the appropriate case, and it will be found and replied to much quicker than sending emails to the individual staff members managing the submission. So always reply to any IRDiRC message without changing the subject, because that contains a token, a code that will ensure the correct routing to the appropriate case. EJP is not needed anymore. The way IRDiRC works is that documents are put into IRDiRC, and even the agency puts documents into a specific folder for the applicant called output from EMA, and they are not sent as email, as attachments to either EJP or standard emails. The email that you receive from IRDiRC will not contain confidential information, and our suggestion is that also in your emails there is no confidential information and no attachments. Everything that needs to be attached should be instead uploaded to the IRDiRC system. As I mentioned already, this system doesn't require the use of the gateway or the repository. These are the systems that the agency currently uses for other submissions, like pediatrics and the centralized. I mentioned already the zip files and then for the references. One aspect is that the system will create for you automatically a summary of the submission in the input from applicant folder, which is called application form. This is done automatically by the system whenever you actually submit the submission, so at the end of your draft submission process. But if you want, you can create intermediate versions of this document if you need to share with your own company the data at any time during the drafting of the submission. You can easily create this document and then download it and share it. And by the way, you can always download the documents that you have already uploaded to the system for your own use at any time, even when the submission is closed. So this is basically the long and short of it. Happy submitting. Any support needed for the registration queries, however, will have to be sent to the EMA service desk. And my recommendation here is that if you cannot access IRDiRC at all, this is likely to be an IAM, account management portal problem, not an IRDiRC problem. And therefore, that's what you should mention in the ticket. I've listed for you here all the guidance that is available for the so-called pre-IRDiRC phase, so the registration of organizations, accounts, affiliations, customer numbers, and substances in the, shall I call them, affiliate systems to IRDiRC, and you can find the registration here. For what concerns specifically the IRDiRC system, a principle to be considered is that we put advice in two different areas. If it's advice about how technically you submit something in IRDiRC, then the IRDiRC guidance is on the IRDiRC homepage. What you find there is an IRDiRC guide to registration, which is a summary of the guidances I've shown you here. Okay, we've collected them for the part relevant to IRIS, and we put them in the IRIS Guide to Registration here under Guidance and Document. And there is also an IRIS Guide to Applicants for scientific applications that shows you how to create a submission in IRIS. There's a general part with the principles, and then there are small sections on the specific procedures to tell you, some specific parts for each procedure, but they are quite small. There's also other documents and videos for training that you can find here. However, bear in mind that the procedural advice for the specific procedures is on the standard EMA website. So if you want to know how to write the scientific document for an orphan designation, for example, you do not go to the IRIS guidance on the IRIS homepage, because here you'll find only technical advice on how actually to send the application to us. How to write the scientific document for orphan designations and scientific advice is actually described in the standard EMA website. There's a research and development homepage with a list here on the bottom, you can see here, where you can find all the procedural advice for the individual types of medicine development submissions. So scientific advice, orphan designations, ITF, and others, of course, including pediatrics, which is not in IRIS yet. If you have further doubts after consulting this wealth of guidance, if you cannot find an answer, you can do other things. For example, the first port of call I would use is to go on the stakeholder forums. The public stakeholder forums is a section of the IRIS website which we have created for two main reasons. A, to inform the IRIS users of new development, and there's a forum for that. And then there is another forum called General Discussion and Self-Help, where you can request questions to other users of the system who are free to answer. You can answer any question. And sometimes we from the European Medicines Agency also provide answers into this. Of course, these are public forums, so do not put confidential information here or specific issues regarding a particular case, a particular product, because it will be visible to all of the users. But it's worthwhile having a look at this, because there's a number of answers to questions that are additional to what you can, and explain better what you can already find in the guidance. If all else fails, guidance, forum, etc., or you need to discuss a specific substance or problem, you should create a service desk ticket via the usual service desk website. And of course, the channel of communication via Ask EMA still remains in use for broader questions about, not specific for a technical problem or an issue, but for broader questions on orphan development, you can still use the Ask EMA communication channel. So as I mentioned, just to reiterate the concept, if you have problems in accessing IRIS at all in affiliation, when you create the service desk ticket, remember to mention IAM EMA Account Management Portal, like this here in the right side of the slide, as the related software rather than IRIS for the access problems. This will actually speed up the answer to your question, because it will then be addressed to the appropriate support colleagues here at the agency. And that concludes my presentation in half an hour, as I said, and I'm now ready for questions. Thank you very much for bearing with me.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I have received one question. I sent it to you via the chat. Can you receive the chat? Can you see the chat?
The chat, yes.
Okay.
Okay, if a company wants to submit a request to harmonize the EU annual reporting period with the US reporting period, how is this logistically been done via IRIS? The real answer is I have no idea, but I mean, the annual reporting period of in the EU, correct me if I'm wrong, Mahia, depends on the registration, on the date of the orphan designation from the Commission. And then I believe the annual report has to be sent within 2 months. Agnieszka, so I'm not sure how you do that in practice. Agnieszka, do you have an answer for this?
Yes, hello, good afternoon. My name is Agnieszka Wilkowska. I work for the Orphan Medicines Office. So as a general rule, the annual reports are expected within 2 months past the anniversary of the Orphan designation. So let's say the Orphan designation was granted by the Commission on the 30th of November. So we would expect the annual report to arrive within 2 months of this anniversary. But of course, it can be also submitted at the time of submission of the annual report to the FDA, and this is in February.
I see another question regarding the RPI. We had problems with finding the RPI in the system, could not be detectable. Yes, this is actually something that deserves a few more words. There are a number of situations in which you are sure that you have an RPI, or there should be an RPI, but still, when you log in into the system, you don't see it, and therefore you cannot choose it. There may be a number of causes for that. First of all, you may be affiliated with the wrong company. For OMS and therefore for IRIS, 2 companies of the same group in different countries are 2 completely different organizations. So if your RPI is owned by, I don't know, Novartis Germany, and you are working for Novartis France, and you have an affiliation only to Novartis France, you will not see the RPIs for Novartis Germany. Simple as that. So you need to request an affiliation also to Novartis Germany to be able to see the RPIs owned by Novartis Germany. Or Novartis Germany can transfer the RPI to Novartis France. And either is possible, and you will see, in this case, the RPI. Another possibility is that the RPI is an old UPI, all the unique product identifiers have been transformed in the RPIs. But for many of them, we didn't actually have the link to the correct organization. Therefore, this needs to be added. So in this case, for example, if you even perhaps know the number of the RPI, you can send an email to a service desk ticket or contact the office directly to ask, why can't I see RPI 123456, which I know exists and should be my company, will do investigations and solve the problem for you. And there may be other issues. They are explained in the guideline, so I won't delve into this, but it's a situation that can happen. You need to contact us, it will be solved. So Maria, you're copying the questions, right, in the chat. Am I correct?
Yes, there's another one in the line for you.
How do you find out who can sign off on the company you want to represent? So I take that you're asking, when you request affiliation, how does it work? Yes, I didn't go through this, but every organization must have at least one IRIS admin user to allow other affiliations to occur. So, in fact, we advise that each organization has at least 2 admin users in case one is not available. The admin users have the power to accept the future request of affiliation to that company. Now, for the nomination of the first admin user, IAM requests proof that that person is authorized to act as admin user. So in IAM, there's a specific procedure for that. The first role to be asked for every company is that of admin user. You will need to attach a document for this, for the admin user role, that proves that you have authority to act as admin user. And then once this admin user is nominated, every, or more than one, which is what we advise, the first admin user can approve new admin users, new industry manager users, new industry contributor users, okay? Because every time a new user requests affiliation to that company, that request will not go to EMA, it will go to the organization's admin user. I hope that is clear. The good thing is that this way we do not need anymore a letter of authorization for every application, because if you are authorized, if you are affiliated to a company, that means that the admin user of that company has given you authorization to do so, and for us that is sufficient. No need for a letter of authorization anymore. Can academia register as an organization? Yes, of course. Is this at the level of university, faculty, institute, research group? That is actually a very good question, because we've had challenges in the past with this, because what happened was that some universities refused to register as an organization and asked their department to do so. Now, it depends on the legislation of the different countries, I believe. If you can register as an organization in, if you have a certificate of incorporation or similar thing that's valid at the level of department, then by all means you can register as a department. On the other hand, if the only legal entity is your broad university, then you need to be registered as a university, and that has created some difficulties. For example, for small departments that wanted to apply for ITF, Innovation Task Force briefing meetings. For them, the solution is that we've suggested that they request the ITF briefing meeting as individuals, because that is always possible. The drawback with orphan designations is if you apply for an orphan designation as an individual, it simplifies a lot of things, yes, but then the orphan designation will be given to the individual, not to the organization. It can, of course, be transferred at a later stage, which happens frequently, to a different organization. But in principle, the OMS system accepts organizations at whatever level, university, faculty, institute, research group, as long as there is a legal registration as a company. Must an organization be located in the EU? And this is actually another relevant question, because the answer is it depends. For OMS and IRIS, of course, it can be EU or non-EU. It doesn't matter. OMS includes all the organizations that one way or another deal with the European Medicines Agency. So, for example, if you want to request in the future scientific advice, it doesn't matter if you're in the US or South Africa or Australia, India, you can ask scientific advice from any country. But for orphan designations, as you know, the legislation says that you have to be based in the EU, whether an organization or an individual. So you can register in OMS and in IRIS an organization in any country in the world, but you can only create and submit an orphan application if you are located in the EU. Well, actually, you can, even if you're not, but then you will be stopped at validation because the legislation requires that you're based in the EU. Can a non-EU register as a super user, admin user, industry admin user? That's not a problem. Anybody can be an industry admin user. I see a lot of questions on the registration of organizations. I have to admit, I'm not exactly an expert on the registration of organizations in SPOR, because the SPOR team is a different team here at the agency. My understanding is that as I just said, any organization, any legal entity can become registered in OMS and therefore in IRIS, regardless of whether it's EU, non-EU. To benefit from some incentives in the EU, you need to be an SME and based in the EU. Now, for orphan designations, as we've said, you need to be based in the EU anyway to apply, and you need to be the same company. The situation gets more complicated for scientific advice, where there can be situations in which de facto we have two applicants. This doesn't apply to orphan designations, however. And when the two applicants want to benefit from the SME incentives, they have both to be SMEs, one in the US, one in EU. You find more answers about this specific case in the forums that I've already mentioned. Go there and look for the question and answer on this particular issue. How can a sponsor change product details register in IRIS? Oh, very interesting questions we're getting today. Some product details can be modified by the sponsor indirectly, some directly, and some not at all. And I assume we're talking about RPIs here. So let's say, for example, that the active substance you have registered changes its preferred term. So let's say you register the substance with a company code initially, but then a new name, a chemical name or a descriptive name becomes available. And you would like that substance to have a changed name, a new name, an updated name, and the company code will remain as a synonym. Now, you need to do this only in SMS, in UTC-T SMS, in the way that I showed you, via currently a service desk ticket with that Excel sheet. And I should like to add that this system is scheduled to change rather shortly, I am told, to a different system, but I do not know much more about that yet, so stay tuned about changes that will be communicated also in the IRIS forums. So if you want to update the name of the substance, you do that in UTC-T SMS directly, and this will update automatically the RPI name, because the RPI name will be updated to reflect the new active substance. This happens automatically in IRIS. So that's an example of indirect changes. Every time you submit a new application, for the time it's limited to scientific advice only, but in the future it should be extended also to orphan drugs. Companies are offered the possibility to update the information, general information on the product or its mechanism of action. So you can add additional information on these, but this is optional, it's not mandatory. There are some things, however, that you cannot change in the product. For example, in the RPI, we have some information regarding on the mechanism of action of the product that we collect from external databases. This is recorded in the product, and you will see it when you create a new application, but this cannot be updated by the applicant. I guess the main situation for the main need for update is to update the substance name, in fact, and this is done automatically, as I told you. However, if you wanted to change the actual substance with a different one, that's trickier, because in principle, if it's a new substance, different substance from the one that was originally in the RPI, then you need a new RPI. It will not be the same RPI as the previous one if the substance is different. I don't want to become too technical. There may be exceptions here for orphan designations when a general moiety is chosen initially and then a specific salt is chosen. But let's say that in principle everything happens automatically when you update the name of the substance in SMS. If it's a new substance, then you need to contact the agency. So we have a next question, which is for registration of an active substance, do one need to have an INN or fulfill other requirements? No, INNs are not available at the time of registration of most substances, in fact, because the WHO only gives you an INN when you have a regulatory submission going on, in principle, I understand. So, or in the early phases, normally what you have is just a chemical name. So every substance in UTC-T SMS has a preferred term, and then it has synonyms. If there is an INN, but how's it called? Not an adopted INN, not a proposed INN, but an agreed INN, that is the favorite preferred term. So if you have an agreed INN, that is what should go in the preferred term. All the rest should be synonyms. If you have a proposed INN, that goes as a synonym, and the main term would still be either the chemical name or the scientific name, or in some cases, even a company code may be acceptable. Although in principle, company codes should not be used as preferred terms, because you cannot get an orphan designation for a product only identified with a company code or a pediatric investigation plan for that matter. So next question, how can I change the contact person for an ongoing orphan application? You can easily do that by going to the portal and requesting to change the contact person. However, to do that, you must first have added that person as another manager for the submission, which also is done through the portal. In fact, at the beginning of a submission, it would be better to always add at least another manager to the application. So in case the initial manager, who will be the portal contact, becomes unavailable, then the other one can be nominated as portal contact and receive the emails. So the way the system works is that the first manager is also nominated as portal contact and will receive all the emails from the system. If you want to change that, you need to add another manager, and then that person has the power to also do things on the submission. And then you need to change the portal contact to that second person. And from that moment on, that second person will receive all the emails from the system. Next question. For a non-EU company with an admin user role plus EU representative with an existing account, the non-EU. I'm not sure I understand this question completely, but the point is, you, as a user affiliated to an organization, you will see only the regulatory entitlements belonging to that organization. So if we have company A and company B, and company B has an orphan designation, only users that are affiliated to company B will be able to see that orphan designation and therefore create an annual report submission for that. Now, if you work for company A, you also need to get affiliation to company B to create a submission like an annual report that requires reference to a regulatory entitlement of company B. I hope I've answered the question correctly. If not, feel free to ask it again. So next question, will PIP applications have to be submitted via the IRDiRC portal? I hope so, sometime in the future, but not next year.
Okay, I think we've run out of questions. Thank you very much. If there's any burning questions, you have one last minute maybe to use the Slido. I can also see that some people had difficulties accessing this, so the email also works of the event. But if we don't receive any more questions within the next minute or two, I think we can then wrap up. Thank you so much, Paolo, for all the informative answers. I think your presentation was also very exhaustive and hopefully informative for the audience. Thank you so much. Yep, no more questions coming in, so I think
no more questions. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Great. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience and for your attendance.